Hello everyone, I reviewed your comments about the lighting and improved the video by adding night scenes and reducing glare as you requested. Thank you for your support and suggestions. Today we are starting a new series about the Appalachian Mountains and I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to support the series with a like and leave any comment. Thank you. I heard it before I understood what I was hearing. The sound came at 3:47 a.m., and it pulled me awake in the ranger station like nothing I'd ever experienced. Not an animal, not wind, not anything that belongs to the natural world in the way you think of it. It was a shriek that existed somewhere between a human scream and the cracking of old wood, sustained for so long that my lungs ached in sympathy. My name is Nathan. I've worked these mountains for 17 years, the high ridges and deep hollows of central Appalachia, and I know every sound these forests make. I know the territorial calls of panthers that people swear don't exist here anymore. I know the death screams of rabbits taken by hawks. I know what wind sounds like moving through a ravine, how a man's voice carries up a mountain face, the difference between a branch snapping under a heavy animal's weight and a tree stress fracture. This was none of those things. The shriek came again, closer. I was out of bed without thinking. Muscle memory from 2 decades of emergency response overriding the part of my brain that wanted to stay under the blankets. The ranger station sits at the edge of Blackwater Hollow, elevation 4 through 200 feet, 5 miles from the nearest access road and 18 from town. You learn early on that when something happens at night in these mountains, you're the response. The electricity cut out as I pulled on my boots. That stopped me. We'd had clear weather for 3 days, no wind, no storms building. The backup generator hummed once and died. All the emergency protocols I'd trained for, all the muscle memory that kept me functioning during crises, suddenly felt theoretical. Power doesn't just fail. Generators have redundancies. I grabbed the flashlight from the emergency kit and moved to the window. The darkness outside was absolute. These mountains have real darkness, the kind without ambient light from towns or highways, the kind that swallows light instead of reflecting it. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing around the station. Nothing, but the sound came again, and this time it was outside the perimeter fence. Much closer. The beam of my flashlight caught movement in the tree line, but not the kind of movement I recognized. It was too fluid, too coordinated. The trees along the fence line began to sway, not from wind but from something moving through them with deliberate, methodical purpose. I radioed for backup before I even thought about whether that made sense. The static that came back was wrong. Layered, distorted, beneath it something that might have been voices or might have been the feeding station for some massive animal. The grinding of bone and muscle. "Dispatch, this is Station 7, I said, my voice steadier than my hands. "I need units at my location. Possible animal incursion, aggressive behavior." The static resolved into something that sounded almost like breathing. The thing at the fence line screamed again, and this time I caught a silhouette. What I saw didn't process at first. My brain refused the information like corrupted data. Impossibly tall, an angular frame that seemed to bend in ways skeletal things shouldn't bend. The head turned toward the station, and I saw the height at which the eyes were positioned. Easily 8 feet? Maybe taller. I killed the flashlight and stepped back from the window. The training kicked in then, the part that doesn't rely on what's logical. Secure the station, check the perimeter, assess resources. I moved through the familiar space of the building by memory, keeping away from the windows, trying to think through what I was looking at. The creature at the fence paced. Back and forth, back and forth. The fence was reinforced chain link, meant to keep out bears and the occasional drifter. It would not stop whatever this was. In the distance I heard the radio crackle, but it wasn't dispatch. It was something else using the frequency. A sound like a throat being slowly torn open. Repeated syllables that almost sounded like words, almost like a name. My name. It was calling me by my name. By dawn, it was gone. The silence when the thing retreated was almost worse than the sound of its presence. I hadn't moved from the back room of the station, an interior space with no windows, where I'd spent the hours listening to the creature pace around the building, occasionally striking the fence with impacts that made the metal sing. Around 4 a.m., the impacts had stopped. By 4:15, I couldn't hear anything at all. I gave it 2 hours before I checked the perimeter. The damage to the fence was extensive. The chain link had been torn outward in several places, as if the creature had tested its strength, found the fence wanting, but then lost interest. I examined the ground for tracks. What I found was worse than prints would have been. A path through the clearing where vegetation was simply flattened, pressed into the earth as if something enormous had dragged itself through. The grass wasn't bent. It was compressed, damaged, the cellular structure burst. Whatever had made that path weight enough to literally crush the plant matter. The path led toward the hiking trail that ran through Blackwater Hollow. I radioed dispatch again. Still static. The generator had power again, though I had no memory of fixing it, and I didn't examine that too closely. I packed a day bag. Water, first aid kit, flare gun, knife, radio. My service weapon was locked in the equipment cabinet. A .357 revolver, 6 bullets. I loaded it. 6 bullets felt like carrying 6 promises I couldn't keep. The trail into Blackwater Hollow is well maintained, marked clearly for the hiking public. I'd walked it hundreds of times. I knew the water crossings, the switchbacks, the place where the old logging road intersects with the footpath. I knew it the way you know your own house in the dark. I didn't recognize it at all in the morning light. The trees along the path were marked. Not blazes, something else. Bark stripped in vertical lines, wounds in the wood still wet with sap. As I moved deeper into the hollow, the wounds got worse. Entire sections of bark ripped away, the trees bleeding resin. And underneath, in some of the exposed wood, I found claw marks. But not like any claw I've ever documented. These marks were too deep, penetrating inches into the heartwood. Whatever made them was stronger than any predator in North America. I found the first body near the water crossing. It had been a deer, a large doe, probably 200 pounds. Now it was a collection of remains, the bones scattered and deliberately arranged, not fed upon the way predators feed. Arranged. The skull faced downhill, mouth open. The spine was laid out in a line, each vertebra placed with precision. The ribs formed an arc, like an opening. I'd documented hundreds of animal kills in these mountains, and I'd never seen anything like this. The remains were fresh, the blood was still tacky. I marked the location on my GPS and kept moving. The path continued deeper into the hollow, and I made myself follow it. Whatever had done this was in these mountains. I needed to understand what I was tracking. By midday, I'd found 4 more bodies. A black bear arranged the same way. 2 more deer. A young elk, which shouldn't have been this far south but apparently was. Each one positioned with that same deliberate care, arranged like something was trying to communicate, like something was spelling out a message in corpses. Near the 4th body, I found something else. A hiking boot. Inside the boot was a foot, or what remained of one. That's when I saw the structure, hidden in a ravine just off the path, partially concealed by deadfall and overgrown rhododendron, was a shelter. Not a natural cave or outcropping. Something built. The framework was constructed from branches, each one positioned with that same deliberate precision I'd seen in the arranged bones. The interior was dark, and I could smell it from 20 feet away, a reek of copper and rot and something else, something ancient and hungry. I didn't go inside. Instead, I turned and ran. I made it back to the station and barricaded myself inside. The radio was working again. I could hear dispatch calling other units asking about my status, but when I tried to transmit, all I got was that sound, that throat-tearing noise that might have been laughing. That's when Ezra showed up. He came walking out of the woods like he'd just been on a casual hike, completely unconcerned, dusty and tired, but not afraid. Ezra runs a hunting lodge about 2 miles northeast of my station, and we see each other at the general store sometimes. He's a good man, quiet, competent, the type who knows how to move through wilderness without making a sound. He was making plenty of sound now, because he was scared. "Nathan, thank God," he said when I opened the door. "I've been hiking since dawn, thought I was dead twice over." I pulled him inside and locked the door. "What did you see?" He sat on one of the station benches and put his head in his hands. "I was checking the boundary of my property, looking for evidence of the fire damage from last month. Around 10 o'clock, I heard this sound. Like nothing natural, like..." He trailed off. "Like what?" "Like something the size of a house, but wrong. The sound it made, Nathan. It was like human and animal both, and it was calling. I could have sworn it was saying words, but not words I understood." I didn't tell him about the arrangement of corpses, about the structure in the ravine, about the boot with the foot still in it. "Did it pursue you?" "No, but it knew I was there. I felt it, and I heard it kill something. I was trying to move quietly, and I found this elk, and it was..." He looked up at me, and I could see the shock in his eyes, the particular blankness that comes from witnessing something the mind cannot categorize. "It was arranged, like on display. And the shelter nearby, did you know there was a shelter? Someone's been living out there." "It's not someone, Ezra." He stared at me. "What do you mean?" I made a decision then. I was going to need help, and hiding in the station wasn't going to get either of us out of these mountains alive. The thing that killed the elk didn't build that shelter in the last few days. That structure has been there for years, maybe longer, and nothing living builds structures to house corpses and arrange them for display like that. Nathan, you're talking like what? Like something is out there that doesn't belong? That exists outside everything we think is possible? I moved to the window and looked out toward the hollow. In these mountains, Ezra, we live with stories, old stories, stories about things that come down from the high ridges when something's wrong, when something's hungry, stories about something that feeds on more than just flesh. He stood up suddenly. You need to get medical attention. The stress, the isolation. My radio has been receiving the same sound over and over again. Not interference, a pattern. It's calling me. It's been calling me all night and all day, and it hasn't stopped. It knows my name, Ezra. How does it know my name? The power failed again. In the darkness of the station, with only the gray afternoon light filtering through the windows, we heard it. Not outside the station this time. Underneath it, moving beneath the building, through the crawl space, dragging something heavy. The boards of the floor groaned. Go, I said. There's a back exit, emergency hatch. Leads to the storage shed. Get to your lodge, get your people, and get out of these mountains. Call everyone you know. Tell them to leave. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice. The thing beneath the station let out a sound that was almost a laugh, and the floor in the corner of the main room cracked. A hand came through the opening, if hand was the right word. It was too long, the fingers too numerous, the joints bending in directions that made my eyes hurt to follow. Ezra ran. I heard him moving through the back of the station. Heard the hatch open, heard his footsteps running toward the tree line. I didn't follow. Instead, I went back into the office where I kept the equipment cabinet. 6 bullets in the revolver. That was what I had. The hand withdrew from the cracked floor. The thing beneath the station was laughing that almost human laugh, and I realized what the sound from the beginning had been. It wasn't calling me, it was howling. It took the building apart slowly, deliberately, like something taking apart a toy to see how it worked. The walls came first. The outer wall of the western room simply collapsed inward as the creature heaved against it with a force that scattered 2x4s like kindling. I watched from the back office as daylight poured into the ruined space, and I finally saw it clearly. The Wendigo, and I knew that's what it was because the old knowledge lived in these mountains like water in the soil, passed down through generations of people who knew that some stories weren't metaphors, was even more horrible in full light than it had been in shadow. The frame was emaciated, all prominent bone and stretched skin that looked like it hadn't been fed properly in months. But that starvation seemed wrong somehow. The skin moved across the ribs like it was independent, like something was living underneath it, something separate. The head was elongated, the jaw unhinged, and the eyes were the worst part. They were human. They held intelligence and hunger and a kind of desperate madness that made me understand, for the first time, that this thing had been human once. It looked directly at me and pulled its mouth open in something that might have been a smile. I fired. The bullet went through the creature's upper chest and exited cleanly. The Wendigo barely reacted. It pulled itself through the hole in the wall, dragging the useless lower half of its body. Damaged sometime in the past, healed wrong. It was hungry not because it couldn't eat, but because it was starving in a way that food couldn't satisfy. I fired again. The second bullet caught it in what would have been a lung on anything living. It made that laughing sound, that throat-tearing noise, and suddenly I was moving, running toward the back of the station, toward the emergency hatch. The creature moved faster than something so damaged should move. It dragged itself across the floor with its hands, and its reach was impossibly long. One of those 2-jointed arms went around my ankle, and the grip was cold, so cold it burned. I twisted and fired downward, putting a bullet through the limb. It released me. I kicked free and threw myself out the hatch. The woods behind the station are dense and steep, leading down into a secondary ravine. I crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and the thing that had been hunting me since the night it screamed my name. I ran downslope for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. My lungs burned. Blood ran from cuts along my face and arms. The forest grew darker as the canopy thickened, and I knew I was heading into the old growth, the deepest part of these mountains, where no one comes and nothing comes out unchanged. That's when I heard other people. A group of hikers, maybe 5 or 6 of them tourists from the looks of their gear, were on the main trail, unaware, setting up camp. I tried to warn them. I came staggering out of the woods like something feral, and they reacted the way people do when a bloodied man emerges from the forest shrieking. They prepared to defend themselves. I was trying to tell them to leave, to get out of the mountains, when I heard it. The Wendigo was still behind me, and it had caught the scent of new prey. It came through the forest like gravity made flesh, and in the moment before it reached the first of the hikers, I understood something crucial. The Wendigo doesn't hunt because it's aggressive. It hunts because it's empty. It hunts because something vital was taken from it when it became this thing, and nothing, no amount of flesh, no quantity of blood, will ever fill that void. The screaming lasted a long time. I ran deeper into the hollow, away from the sound, away from the images I'd glimpsed. I had one bullet left. The gun was shaking in my hand. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time didn't work right in those mountains anymore. The light faded, and I found myself moving through darkness deeper than any darkness I'd known, guided by the sound of water. Blackwater Creek flows south through the hollow, and I followed it downslope. Near dawn, I came upon the shelter again. Not the one the Wendigo had made, a different one, older, built solidly of stone and timber, positioned in a way that made me think it had been constructed to withstand something, to be a defense against something. There were names carved into the doorframe, dozens of them. Some dated back over 100 years. There was a knife on the floor of the shelter left there deliberately, and a note, written in hand so old the ink had faded to brown. If it takes you, if it makes you become as it is, use this. Don't let it take anyone else. Don't let it wear your skin, and remember your life. I sat there in that shelter as the sun came up, and I made a decision. The Wendigo wanted me. I could feel it calling, that noise underneath the normal sounds of the world, the frequency of its hunger tuned to my presence. I was the thing it had marked first, and if I let it take me, if I let it learn to wear my shape and use my knowledge of these mountains, my knowledge of where people lived and how they thought and where they were vulnerable. The gun went in my mouth, but I couldn't pull the trigger. Instead, I took the knife and walked out of that shelter, back toward the sound of the creatures calling. I walked until I came to the edge of a cliff face, high enough that the trees below looked like moss. I stood there, and I made an offer to whatever was listening. The Wendigo found me in the afternoon light. It was moving differently, faster. It was learning. It had fed on the hikers, and something about that feast had given it strength. It pulled itself up the slope toward me with those terrible hands, and I didn't run. I'll make a deal, I said. Take me, make me what you are, but you stay here. You stay in these mountains. You don't go into town. You don't take any more hikers. You feed only on what the land provides. And every few weeks I'll come to you. I'll bring something to feed on. A deer, an elk, whatever I can catch. Just promise me you won't spread beyond Blackwater Hollow. The Wendigo stopped, its two human eyes fixed on me, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Recognition, not of me but of the concept. The agreement. The hungry thing in the mountains is old, older than words, but it understands hunger and it understands deals. It understands the binding nature of a promise made to something that hungers. It pulled itself toward me with purpose now, but not to kill. I felt the teeth sink in, felt the cold grip of its grip, felt something vast and empty and ancient begin to rewrite what I was from the inside out. The pain was extraordinary, like being unmade and remade simultaneously. When I woke up, I was something else. I'm still here, still in these mountains. Still Nathan, but not Nathan anymore. The hunger is constant, a roaring thing that drowns out most other thoughts. But I'm holding to the deal. I feed on the land, and every few weeks I walk into town, carefully, in the dark, in the places where shadows are deepest, and I take something. A dog, a stray cat, a homeless man no one is looking for. It's not enough. The hunger is never satisfied. But it's the deal I made. And the thing inside me that used to be human, the part that remembers Nathan, the ranger, the man who cared about these mountains, that part is holding it to that deal. Come to Blackwater Hollow and you might meet me on the trail. I still look mostly human, if you don't look too close. If you don't examine my fingers too carefully, or the way my jaw hinges, I'll warn you to leave, the way Ezra should have warned everyone else. Most people don't listen. The Wendigo never goes hungry for long. The call came in at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. I remember the exact time because the dispatcher's voice cut through my sleep like a knife through silk, precise and cold. A hiker missing in the Daniel Boone National Forest, last known location Rock Castle River Gorge, elevation 2,100 feet. No cell phone signal, no emergency beacon. Just a man named Hudson Prescott who'd gone out for a solo trail run at dawn and never came back. I've been a search and rescue coordinator for the Appalachian regions for 12 years. I've found the dead and the alive, the desperate and the grateful. I've dragged bodies out of ravines and talked panicked hikers down from ledges, but I'd never heard a sound like the one Hudson Prescott made when we finally found him. The forest around Rock Castle is old in a way that most Americans can't comprehend. These mountains are weathered down to their bones, worn smooth by time in a way that makes them feel less like geography and more like the carcass of something vast. The trees grow thick and knotted, their bark thick as leather. The air smells like decay and rich earth, like 1,000 years of things dying and returning to soil. It's beautiful. It's suffocating. I assembled my team that morning. Silas Chen, my second in command, arrived first. He's lean and methodical, the kind of man who checks his equipment twice and never makes mistakes. Beside him came Matthew Torres, our wilderness medic, and Grayson Reeves, a volunteer with an uncanny ability to read terrain like other people read books. They were good men, the kind you want when things go wrong in places where things very often go wrong. The morning broke gray and cold. We loaded our packs, rope, water, first aid, thermal imaging, GPS units that would lose signal the moment we descended into the gorge. Around us, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in mist. I could hear wind in the canopy, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Prescott left his car at the trailhead at 5:30 a.m., I told the team as we geared up. Friend reported him missing around 1 p.m. when he didn't show up for lunch. That gives us an 8-hour window before we get the call. Could have gotten hurt early, Matthew said, strapping on his medical pack. Could be anywhere from here to the river. Could be dead, Grayson added. He wasn't being cruel, just practical. In SAR, you consider worst-case scenarios the way other people consider the weather. We started at first light, descending into the gorge on a trail that switched back through dense rhododendron and mountain laurel. The vegetation was so thick in places that even in daylight we felt like we were moving through twilight. Above us, the canopy blocked out the sky. The only sound was our boots on the path, and the distant sound of water. The rock castle, churning brown and loud in its stone bed below. By 9 a.m. we'd covered 2 miles and found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no sign that Hudson Prescott had ever been this way. The search area was expanding exponentially. If he'd left the trail, he could be anywhere in thousands of acres of wilderness. My radio crackled with updates from the team spreading out through the forest, and all of them said the same thing, nothing. That's when Silas heard it. He held up his hand, and we all stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard it too. A sound like something between a moan and a howl, distant and muffled, coming from deeper in the gorge. It didn't sound human. It sounded like an animal in extreme pain, something caught and dying, something hungry. That way, Grayson said, pointing toward a ravine that fell away steeply through a maze of laurel thickets. We moved off trail, pushing through vegetation so dense it felt like the forest was trying to hold us back. Branches grabbed at our packs and faces. The ground beneath us became unstable, loose stone and wet earth that threatened to send us tumbling every other step. The sound came again, and this time I could pinpoint it better. It was coming from below us, from the deepest part of the ravine where sunlight never reached. We descended for what felt like an hour but was probably 20 minutes. The ravine narrowed until we were moving almost single file, and then we came out into a small clearing beside a creek, and there was Hudson Prescott, or what was left of him. Hudson was hanging from the branch of a dead oak, suspended by something that looked like strips of burlap but wasn't. His head hung at an angle that meant his neck was broken, and his torso was open. Not torn, opened, like someone had carefully made surgical incisions and peeled him open to look at what was inside. The smell was indescribable, not quite rot, not quite copper, something older and deeper, like opening a tomb. "Nobody move," I said, and my voice sounded strange in the silence. "Matthew, check for vitals. Silas, set up the perimeter. Grayson, get me a photo log." They moved like automatons, doing the jobs they were trained to do while their minds recoiled from what they were seeing. Matthew approached the body, checked, and looked back at me. He didn't need to say anything. There was no pulse to find, no breath to restore. Hudson Prescott had been dead for hours. What struck me most wasn't the violence. I had seen violence before. It was the deliberation of it. This wasn't a kill made by a panicked predator or an animal defending territory. This was careful, methodical. The body had been positioned like something being studied. "Say CR to home base," I said into my radio, my voice steady through sheer force of will. "We've located the missing hiker, Hudson Prescott, at coordinates." I read them off, watching the numbers appear on my GPS. "We're going to need law enforcement and recovery, Subject is deceased, and we're treating this as a potential crime scene. The dispatcher acknowledged, and I could hear the shift in the building behind her, the calling of sheriffs, the alerting of coroners, the machinery of death beginning to turn. It was Grayson who noticed the tracks. He was the kind of tracker who could read a forest the way a scholar reads a book, finding meaning in things the rest of us wouldn't notice. He was crouched near the body, about 5 feet away, studying something in the earth. "These are fresh," he said. "Whatever did this was here recently, within the last few hours." I moved over to look. The tracks were deep and deliberate, visible in the soft earth near the creek. They were large, larger than any bear track I'd ever seen, and the pattern was wrong. Almost bipedal, but not quite. Too long in the stride, too deep in the toe indentations. Whatever made them was heavy and moved with a kind of loping gait, like something that could run on 2 legs when it needed to but preferred 4. "How fresh?" I asked. "Couple hours," Grayson said. "Maybe less." The implication hit all of us at the same time. Whatever had done this wasn't far away. Over the next 2 hours, we waited for the authorities while maintaining the crime scene. We didn't touch the body. We took photographs and video. We marked the perimeter with flagging tape, and we watched the forest around us, suddenly aware that we weren't alone in it. The temperature had dropped. I could see our breath in the air, and the normal sounds of the forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insect chorus, just the creek, speaking in low murmurs over its stones, and the wind in the upper canopy, distant and cold. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Matthew said quietly. He was standing near me, his pack already repacked, his medical gear untouched. "I've never seen anything like this." "Never seen those tracks either," Grayson added. Silas said nothing. He was staring into the forest beyond the body, his hand resting on the bear spray at his belt. I realized he was genuinely afraid, and that frightened me more than anything else I'd seen that day. The law enforcement team arrived in the late afternoon, 2 sheriffs and a coroner's investigator, a woman named Evelyn who'd been investigating deaths in the Appalachian region for longer than I'd been in SAR. She took one look at the body and her face went pale. "I need to examine this," she said, her voice tight. "Before anything is moved." She spent 45 minutes photographing and documenting. She took samples of the material Hudson was suspended from. They were definitely strips of human skin, kept fresh somehow. She collected the clothing, the blood evidence, the material from his hands where he'd apparently tried to fight back, though against what, I couldn't imagine. When she was done, she stood beside me, and I could see her hands were shaking slightly. "I've never seen an injury pattern like this," she said. "The precision of it, the positioning, it's almost like..." "Like what?" I asked. "Like it was eating him," she said. "Not all at once, not with the savagery of a predator, but carefully, over time, taking only what it needed." The news hit the region like a stone thrown into still water. Missing hiker found dead in national forest under mysterious circumstances. By evening, the story had made it to the local news. By the next morning, it was on every station, not just regional but national. Cryptid hunters and internet sleuths began arriving in the area within hours, setting up cameras and calling out into the forest with equipment designed to capture ghosts. But something else was happening too. Reports started coming in from other hikers and locals. Strange sounds in the deep hollows at night, sounds that didn't match any animal anyone could identify. Livestock going missing in the communities near the forest. And, most disturbing, signs of something large moving through the deep wilderness. Something that left tracks but never seemed to be seen. Something that left destruction in its wake. I spent the next week with state police and the FBI who'd taken over the case. They had helicopters and dogs and advanced forensics. They found nothing. The tracks leading away from Hudson's body simply ceased after about 2 miles, as if whatever made them had taken to the rocks or the upper branches of the trees and disappeared. The real turning point came on the 8th day after we found the body. I was leading a team on a follow-up search deeper into the gorge when we found the deer. It was an elk, actually. Massive, easily 700 pounds, and it had been treated exactly the way Hudson had been treated. Hung from a tree, opened with precision, laid out like something being studied and dissected, but this one was fresh. No more than a few hours dead. That meant the creature, because I'd stopped calling it an animal and started calling it a creature, was still active, still hunting, still moving through territory that was supposed to be patrolled and protected and known. That night, I camped at the ranger station with Silas, and we didn't sleep. We sat in the break room with thermoses of black coffee and watched the windows, and I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind since we found Hudson's body. "What are we dealing with?" I said. Silas took a long time to answer. When I was growing up, he said finally, my grandmother used to tell us stories, old stories from the old country, but stories about the mountains too, stories she'd picked up from people she'd met. She told us about things that lived in the deep places, the oldest places, things that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human, things that had been here longer than we had. Fairy tales, I said, but it came out as a question. Maybe, Silas replied. Or maybe just names for things we can't explain. Things we're afraid to name. The next morning, I got a call from Grayson. He was at home, in town, and his voice was wrong. High and tight, barely controlled. I'm in the hospital, he said. I'm okay, but something happened. Something came into my backyard last night. I was at the hospital in 20 minutes. Grayson was in the emergency room with claw marks across his shoulder and back, 4 parallel gouges that had missed his spine by inches. The attending physician was baffled. The marks were too large to be from any animal in the region, but too deliberate to be anything wild. What happened? I asked. I was on the back porch, Grayson said, his voice hoarse. It was around midnight. I heard something in the woods, that sound, the one like a moan and a howl. And then it was on the porch. I didn't see it clearly, but I felt it, and I ran. It was fast. If I hadn't been moving, it would have had me. What did you see? I pressed. Tall, Grayson said. Taller than any man. Thin, but not weak thin. Starved thin. Like something that's been hungry for a very long time. And the smell, Jesus, the smell. Like a dead animal mixed with rotten meat, mixed with something I've never smelled before. Something old. I sat with him for an hour, and then I did something I should have done earlier. I went to the library and I started researching old folklore. Appalachian legends, mountain stories, things that had been documented and written down by folklorists and collectors. What I found was a pattern. Over the past 200 years, there had been incidents, unexplained deaths, missing people, animals found laid out with surgical precision, tracks that didn't match any known creature, and, in the oldest accounts, descriptions that were chillingly consistent, tall and thin, starved-looking, a smell like death and old things, bipedal but wrong, and always, always, an air of horrible intelligence, of purpose. By the 10th day after finding Hudson Prescott, the search had expanded to include 5 agencies and over 40 personnel. We were combing the forest with thermal imaging and drone footage and every tool available to law enforcement, and we were finding nothing. It was as if the creature had somehow become aware that it was being hunted and had retreated to the deepest, oldest parts of the mountains, to places that no amount of modern technology could access. That's when I made the connection. The old accounts, the folklore, the stories that kept recurring in the documents I'd found, they all mentioned the same Appalachian name for the thing. A thing that came in times of hardship and hunger. A thing that was so feared that people rarely spoke its name aloud. The Wendigo. According to the accounts, it wasn't originally from these mountains. It came from farther north, from the coldest places, from regions where survival was measured in degrees and the line between life and death was razor thin. But over generations, some of them had migrated south, following the mountains like a spine down the continent. They nested in the deepest gorges, the most remote hollows, places where humans rarely ventured, and they were driven by an hunger that couldn't be satisfied. I brought my findings to the FBI agent leading the case, a woman named Caroline who'd been nothing but professional and skeptical until I laid out the folklore research on her desk. You're telling me, she said slowly, that you think we're dealing with a Wendigo. I'm telling you that the evidence matches the historical descriptions, I said. I'm telling you that whatever this is has been hunting in these mountains for a long time. And I'm telling you that we're not going to find it using normal methods because it's not normal. Caroline studied me for a long moment. Then she said, even if I believed in Wendigos, which I don't, what would you suggest we do? Hunt a supernatural creature with a team of federal agents and state police? I don't know, I admitted. But I know we need to stop thinking like we're looking for a person or a regular predator. We need to think about what we're actually dealing with. That night, sitting alone in my cabin on the edge of the national forest, I began to understand the depths of my fear. Because if the creature was indeed something out of the old stories, then it wasn't just a killer. It wasn't just a predator acting out of instinct. It was something that had endured for centuries, something that had learned to be clever, that had learned how to hide, that had learned that humans could be broken and managed and kept as resources. Hudson Prescott had been a resource. The elk had been a resource. And if Grayson's attack was any indication, the creature was beginning to see the human population around the forest not as threats, but as food that walked on its own. I was staring out my window, into the darkness of the forest beyond my property, When I saw the tracks in the snow, it had snowed that afternoon. Just a light dusting, but enough to show prints clearly. And there, in the snow in my front yard, were the tracks. Large bipedal with toe indentations that suggested a creature that walked on two legs but could transition to four when it needed to move fast. The tracks came from the forest, stopped about 10 feet from my window, and then turned and walked back into the darkness. It had been here. It had been watching me. I didn't go back to work for 2 days. I stayed in my cabin with the doors locked and the lights on, and I read everything I could find about Wendigos. Most of it was nonsense, pop culture interpretations and horror movie depictions, but buried in the older folklore texts, I found consistent details. Wendigos were not mindless. They were intelligent, strategically intelligent. They hunted with purpose and patience, and most importantly, according to the oldest accounts, they called. The sound I'd heard near Rockcastle Gorge, that moan-howl hybrid, wasn't just a vocalization. It was a call, a communication. And according to the folklore, it could reach into the minds of those who heard it, could plant a hunger there, could slowly transform a human being into something like itself. I didn't want to believe it. But I found myself, at 2 a.m. on the third night of isolation, standing on my porch, listening to the forest, and then I heard it. The call, distant and muffled, coming from the direction of the deep gorges, and it was different now. There was something almost mournful in it, something that pulled at something deep in my chest. I understood, in that moment, why the old stories said that hearing a Wendigo's call could lead to transformation. Because for just a moment, I felt the hunger, not physical, but something deeper. A hunger for the wild places, for the freedom of the forest, for an escape from the constraints of civilization. I went inside and locked the door. The next morning, I received a call that changed everything. Matthew, our medic, had been found on a hiking trail about 5 miles from his home. He was alive but barely conscious, and he was sick, not with any infection the hospital could identify, but with something that seemed to be consuming him from the inside. He was running a fever of 106 degrees, and his body was wasting away at an impossible rate. In the 48 hours he was in the hospital, he lost 40 pounds. When I visited him, I barely recognized him. His eyes had a fevered gleam and his skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. He gripped my arm with fingers that felt like bone. "It called me," he whispered. "After the first search, it called me. I fought it at first, but it was so patient, so persistent. And the hunger, God, the hunger." "What do you mean it called you?" I asked. "In dreams at first," Matthew said. "Then when I was awake, it was like someone singing to me from very far away, and the closer I got to it, the better I could hear it, the more real it became. I went out looking for it, you understand? I was going to find it, and he trailed off, his eyes drifting to the window where snow was beginning to fall. "And what?" I pressed. "And join it," he finished. "I think I was supposed to become like it. I think that's what it does. It finds people and it calls them, and it changes them slowly into something like itself. New members for its pack if it has a pack. I don't know." It was getting harder to think in the end, to remember what I was before the hunger. Matthew died 3 days later, and the hospital couldn't explain why. His body simply shut down, as if the hunger had finally consumed him entirely. I understood then that I couldn't let this continue, that the creature wasn't going to be caught by normal means, and that it wasn't going to leave. It had found a good hunting ground, and it would keep hunting until there was nothing left but empty villages and abandoned homes. So I did something I should never have done, something that went against every protocol and procedure I'd learned in 2 decades of SAO work. I decided to hunt it. I spent a week preparing. I gathered supplies, not the standard gear of search and rescue, but things I thought might be needed to track and confront something that existed partly in folklore and partly in the real world. I studied maps of the deepest gorges, the places where the Wendigo's tracks had led the deepest into the wilderness. And I prepared myself mentally for the possibility that I might not come back. Then, on a cold morning in late November, I ventured into the Deep Hollow, the locals' name for the most remote section of Rockcastle Gorge, where the gorge was so steep and narrow that sunlight never reached the bottom, where the temperature stayed just above freezing even in summer, where the oldest growth of the forest still stood, untouched by human tools. I went alone, against every instinct of self-preservation, and as I descended deeper into that place, the normal sounds of the forest fell away until there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the creek below, speaking in whispers. The smell reached me first, that rotten death and ancient things smell that Grayson had described. And then I saw it. It was standing on a ledge above me, silhouetted against a rare break in the canopy where weak sunlight filtered through. It was taller than I'd imagined, its frame impossibly thin, its posture hunched and wrong, its head turned toward me with a sound like cracking bone. For a moment, just a moment, it made the call, and I felt it. The pull, the hunger, the promise of something beyond the constraints of being human. I understood why Matthew had wanted to walk into the forest and keep walking until he became something else, because the hunger it offered wasn't pain or suffering. It was escape, freedom from the weight of being human, of being bound to a body that aged and grew sick and eventually died. But I also understood that this escape was a lie, that the hunger could never be satisfied, that the creature before me was cursed with an eternal appetite that fed on itself, that every transformation it made only deepened its isolation, its need, its desperation. I raised the flare gun I'd brought with me, and I fired. The flare shot upward in a brilliant arc of red light, and the creature shrieked, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to split reality itself. It moved with impossible speed, scrambling up the rock face and disappearing into the canopy. I didn't pursue it. Instead, I turned and walked out of the deep hollow, my heart pounding, my mind reeling from what I'd seen and felt and almost become. When I emerged from the forest, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The search teams found me an hour later, alive and sane, though changed in ways I still don't fully understand. The official report stated that the death of Hudson Prescott was caused by an unidentified large predator, most likely a grizzly that had migrated farther south than previously recorded. The incident with Grayson was ruled an animal attack, survival instinct-based, nothing more. Matthew's death was attributed to complications from an unknown infection, probably caught during his time in the forest. No one wanted to believe the truth, and perhaps that's for the best. But I know what hunts in those mountains, and I know that every cold night when the wind howls through the gorges and the old forest grows silent, it's still there, still hungry, still calling. And on the nights when I hear that sound in my dreams, I have to remind myself who I am and what I've chosen to be. I have to remember that the hunger was a lie, even though part of me, a part that grows larger with every passing year, isn't entirely sure. The mountains have a way of calling you back, you see, even after you've escaped them, especially then. The static arrived before I did. I remember that most clearly, not the mountains, not the cold weight of my gear, not even the wrongness I'd felt since turning onto the service road. What I remember is the moment my radio stopped working entirely, mid-sentence, while I was trying to reach Hudson back at base camp. For 3 seconds there was nothing but white noise that seemed almost alive, pulsing like something breathing. Then it cut to absolute silence, and I knew something was deeply wrong. My name is on the maps now. Not that anyone will understand what that means. I'm a wilderness guide and search coordinator with 15 years of experience in these Appalachian peaks. I've led people through weather that would break lesser guides, found lost hikers in conditions that seemed impossible, and walked these mountains at night more times than I can count. I've never been afraid of the dark here. Fear was something I understood intellectually, something I taught people to manage. Not something that seized your chest and made your vision tunnel. But that night on Harrow Ridge changed what I knew about fear. It started 3 days before the radio incident. Hudson called at 6 a.m., his voice tight with something that wasn't quite panic. Hudson was the type who didn't panic. He was a 20-year veteran, weathered like the stone itself, and nothing in his measured tone suggested distress. But I'd learned to hear what Hudson left unsaid. "We need you at the North Sector," he'd said. "Missing persons report came in last night. 23-year-old woman named Elena. She was hiking solo, which was stupid, and her boyfriend went looking for her around sunset. Found her backpack near Split Ravine, but no sign of Elena." Split Ravine. That's where the first strangeness had begun. By the time I reached Split Ravine, the sun had become something distant, obscured behind a haze that seemed to hang permanently over the eastern slope. Not fog, something else. The air tasted wrong, metallic and old, like sucking on a penny that had been buried for decades. The ravine itself shouldn't have been that silent. In my experience, wilderness always has a voice. Birds, insects, the subtle whisper of small animals in the brush. Harrow Ridge was a wasteland of quiet. When I stood at the precipice and called Elena's name, my voice seemed to get absorbed into the stone itself. It didn't echo back, it just vanished. Thomas was already there, the ranger who'd been working the North Sector for 6 months. He was lean and competent, moved through the landscape like water, and right now he looked like someone who'd seen his reflection in a dark pool and didn't recognize himself. "She's not down there," he said immediately before I could ask. We've searched the bottom of the ravine twice. The water is running cold but not fast enough to have carried a body. We found her backpack wedged between rocks, but..." He stopped, his jaw working. "But what?" I pressed. The backpack was open, and everything inside was perfectly arranged. Her sleeping bag, her water bottles, her phone in its case, all of it positioned like someone had carefully removed each item and placed it just so. It's not what you find when someone falls. My stomach did something complicated. I spent the next 4 hours searching the ravine myself, picking my way over wet stone and twisted roots, calling Elena's name until my throat felt scraped raw. I found evidence that Thomas was right. The orderly placement of gear wasn't accidental, but I also found something he hadn't mentioned. Scratches on the rock face, parallel marks that descended toward the water. Long marks, as if something with claws or fingers had been dragging downward. The sun was setting when I climbed back out, and Thomas had the camp lanterns lit. He'd made coffee, and the normalcy of it felt obscene. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The birds stopped singing at 3 p.m. They just left, every one of them. The whole forest went quiet, and they haven't come back." He was right. I hadn't consciously noticed their absence, but now that he'd named it, the silence screamed. That was the night I first saw it. I decided to stay at the camp, help with the search continuing into the early morning hours. Hudson was coordinating from base, trying to organize a wider team. Thomas had gone back to the ravine with a fresh battery pack for the searchlights. I was meant to be resting, but sleep felt like a luxury I wasn't allowed anymore. Around midnight, I stepped outside the tent for air. The stars were so bright that night. Painfully bright, the kind of clarity you only get in high elevations when the air is thin and clean. I remember looking up at Polaris, getting my bearings, the kind of automatic thing a guide does without thinking. That's when I noticed the shape. It was perched on the ridge to the north, silhouetted against the stars, and it was wrong in a way that made my hindbrain scream. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe larger, and the wings, God, the wings. They weren't folded against its body like a bird's. They were half extended, moving slowly, catching starlight like oil on water, like they were made of something that wasn't quite real, that reflected reality back slightly distorted. I don't remember screaming, but Thomas said he heard it from the ravine. I don't remember running back into the tent. What I do remember is the weight of the moment stretched out, that impossible shape holding perfectly still on the ridge, and the feeling of something's attention falling on me like a physical thing. Something curious. Something hungry. When I finally moved, it was gone. Thomas came running back with his light cutting through the darkness, and I was standing in the middle of camp, unable to explain what I'd seen. How do you describe something that your rational mind instantly rejects? How do you describe the wrongness of proportions, of a face that had too many angles, of eyes that seemed to catch the starlight in colors that don't exist in nature? "What did you see?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp with a fear that matched my own. "I don't know," I told him. It was the only true thing I could say. By the morning of day 3, we'd expanded the search to 12 people. Hudson had organized climbers from the Park Service, volunteers from Elena's hometown, even a couple of county officials who showed up looking serious and worried. The official line was still missing person, possible accident. No one wanted to acknowledge that something else was happening. The weather had turned strange, not cold exactly, but layered. Warm when the sun hit you directly, then ice water cold the moment you moved into shadow. The haze from yesterday had thickened. It hung over the eastern mountains like something alive, pressing down. I was working the ridge system about 2 miles north of camp when the static started. My radio crackled to life with that sound, not the normal burst of someone keying the mic, but a sustained, almost modulated static. It rose and fell like something breathing. I tried to key back and got nothing but more of that terrible organic sound. Then Hudson's voice cut through, distorted and layered. "All units back to base. Possible sighting. North sector." But Hudson was at base camp, 6 miles south. The transmission didn't make sense. And the way his voice sounded, layered over itself like it was coming from multiple mouths at once. I was moving back toward camp before I'd consciously decided to move. The world had shifted somehow. The ridges looked different. The angles wrong, the distances confusing. I'd walked these mountains long enough that I had an internal compass, and it was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the geometry of the terrain. What should have been a 40-minute walk back to camp took 3 hours. When I finally got within visual range, I could see figures gathered at the perimeter. 12 people, all standing perfectly still, all facing north, toward the ridgeline where I'd seen the shape. I called out, but no one turned. Not Hudson, not Thomas, not any of the volunteers. They were in some kind of state, breathing, standing upright, but fundamentally absent. I moved toward them, fear and something else warring in my chest, and that's when I heard the sound. It was like nothing in nature. A sound that started as a low subsonic vibration in your bones and rose into frequencies that human ears probably shouldn't perceive. It wasn't a scream. It was something older than screaming, something primal and fundamental. It was the sound of something vast and utterly alien trying to communicate in a frequency that human neurology could process. And when I looked up, I saw the lights. They emerged from the haze, dozens of them, soft, phosphorescent points of luminescence that moved through the sky with purpose and intelligence. They didn't move like any aircraft I'd seen. They moved like they were swimming through the air itself, each light a soft brown red that seemed to pulse in rhythm with that terrible sound. I remember thinking, with the cold clarity of someone whose mind is about to break, that we were being studied, that whatever was happening on Harrow Ridge, whatever had taken Elena, whatever had frozen these people in their trance, it was all part of something larger. We were specimens under a lens. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Time had become meaningless. I followed the river downstream, kept the water sound in my ears as my only reliable sense, and tried not to think about whether the shape was following me. At some point, I made it to the road. I flagged down a county truck that was heading toward the park. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask questions, just drove me to the nearest town. The official report when it came 3 days later was straightforward. Elena had fallen into Split Ravine. Her body was eventually found at the bottom, with injuries consistent with trauma. The search party had gotten disoriented during the nighttime search, which was documented in their statements but attributed to exhaustion and rough terrain. No one mentioned the missing 4 hours. No one mentioned the way Hudson and the others stared blankly when they came out of it, unable to account for lost time. No one mentioned that 3 of the 12 searchers never came back to the camp that night, and their bodies were never found. I was treated for exposure and psychological shock. The authorities were kind but dismissive. Mountain search and rescue takes its toll, and sometimes experienced guides have episodes of stress-induced dissociation. The human mind under extreme pressure sometimes generates memories that feel like experience but aren't real. I know what I saw. Thomas filed a formal report that was buried under bureaucratic red tape. He quit the Park Service 2 weeks later and moved to Nevada. I tried to contact him once, but his phone number was disconnected. Whatever he experienced that night, he chose to run from it rather than process it. It's been 6 months now, and the strange part is how the world moves on. Elena's death became a cautionary tale about solo hiking. The missing rangers were attributed to an undiscovered ravine and difficult terrain. Harrow Ridge returned to being just another patch of Appalachian wilderness, beautiful and harsh and unremarkable, but I still monitor the rangers' reports for that sector. I've read every account of unusual sightings in the northern mountains from the past decade. I've found 23 documented incidents that match the pattern I experienced. People going missing in specific locations, search parties encountering disorientation, unusual electromagnetic interference with communication equipment. 23 times the official explanations are convenient and insufficient. The lights are still out there. I know this because of the reports, yes, but more importantly, because of what I understand now. The Mothman, that's what locals called the shape I saw, though I'd never heard of it before that night, isn't hunting, it's surveying. It's been surveying these mountains for longer than records exist. Sometimes I drive past the turnoff to Harrow Ridge. I never go up, but I watch the haze that perpetually hangs over the eastern slope. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Elena's backpack and the way her things were arranged with such careful precision. I think about what being studied means. The radio in my car has always had occasional static. It's normal, but sometimes, very late at night when I'm driving alone through these mountains, I hear that modulated pattern again, that breathing sound. It's not a malfunction, it's a signal that says the thing on Harrow Ridge is still aware of me, still interested. It's waiting, and in my worst moments I wonder if I'm waiting too. If that night on the ridge changed something fundamental in me the way some insects get marked when a predator passes. If I'm still in its lens, part of its ongoing study of what lives in these mountains and what can be taken. The worst part isn't the fear of what I saw. It's the growing certainty that I'm not done with Harrow Ridge. That someday, drawn by something I can't name and can't resist, I'll drive back up that service road and walk into the mist. And this time, I won't come back to tell the story. I took the job at Glacier because I was running, not from the law or anything dramatic like that, but from something quieter and more insidious, the feeling that I didn't belong anywhere anymore. After 7 years in Denver managing office logistics for a tourism company, I'd become a ghost in my own life. My ex-wife used to say I had a dead-eyed look even when I was smiling. She wasn't wrong. The Park Service posted the position in late August. Remote Ranger Station, Glacier National Park, Montana. Minimum 2-year commitment. The salary was modest. The isolation was absolute. It felt like redemption. My interview happened over video call on a Tuesday morning. The ranger supervisor, a woman named Vera Cross with silver streak through black hair, gave me the standard questions. Why conservation? Why Montana? Why such a remote posting? My answers were honest enough. I told her I needed clarity. I told her I wanted to do work that meant something. I didn't tell her that Denver had started to feel like drowning in shallow water, that every morning I woke up feeling like I was suffocating in the life I'd built. Vera paused after my last response. She was looking at something off camera, maybe notes about me, maybe just collecting her thoughts. When she looked back, her expression had shifted into something I couldn't quite read. "We don't get many candidates willing to stay out there for that stretch of time," she said. "Not anymore. People want cell service. They want towns nearby. They want normal." "I'm not looking for normal," I told her. She hired me that same week. The drive from Kalispell to the ranger station took 4 hours. I'd never been to Glacier before, and the landscape ambushed me with its scale. The mountains rose up black and raw against an October sky, snow already claiming the higher elevations. Stands of pine and larch stretched in every direction, so thick and unbroken that the forest seemed less like nature and more like something geological, ancient and indifferent. My station sat on the eastern shore of Glacier Lake, about 8 miles from the nearest access road. The building itself was modest. Log construction, maybe 1,200 square feet. A main room served as office and living area combined. A small bedroom. A kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to occupy simultaneously. The bathroom had a composting toilet that I would need to learn to maintain. Behind the station, a shed held emergency supplies, a generator, extra fuel, and equipment for search and rescue operations. The isolation was absolute. No cell service, no internet. A 2-way radio provided my only regular contact with the outside world, and I was expected to check in once daily at 7 in the evening. Vera had come with me to do the handover. She walked me through the systems, the emergency protocols, the logbooks. She showed me where everything was kept and explained that my primary responsibilities were monitoring the backcountry, maintaining trails, and responding to emergencies. Search and rescue could mean anything from finding a lost hiker to recovering remains. The park pulled roughly 3 to 5 bodies per year from the backcountry. Natural causes, mostly, falls, exposure, the occasional preventable tragedy from someone who'd underestimated the mountains. "We don't get many visitors this far out," Vera told me, standing in the doorway as the late afternoon light turned everything amber. "The lake is remote. The trails aren't marked well. Most people stick to the more accessible areas, but sometimes hikers push farther than they should. And occasionally, we get people passing through who shouldn't be here at all." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, and I saw her choose her words carefully. "Poachers, sometimes. People with no respect for the park. But also, the local tribes have stories about this area. Old stories. They don't hike here much anymore, not since it became a national park at least." "What kind of stories?" Vera turned to look out at the lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains and the darkening sky like a mirror. "The kind that kept people alive for 1,000 years, she said quietly. "The kind that meant something. You should talk to people in the nearest town if you want to know more. But I'll warn you, the locals are protective of those stories. They won't share them with someone from outside unless you earn that trust." She left the next morning. I watched her drive away, her truck disappearing around the curve in the access road, and felt something close to relief. I was alone now. Truly alone. No one could find me here unless I wanted to be found. No one could ask anything of me or judge the choices I'd made. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the space. The station had belonged to previous rangers, and I could feel the weight of their presence in the worn furniture and the marks on the walls. Someone had scratched a calendar into the wooden frame of the main window, marking off days. Hundreds of them. I wondered what they were counting down to, and whether they'd made it to the end of their assignment unchanged. That first night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the forest. The silence wasn't complete. There was wind in the trees, the distant sound of water. The small movements of nocturnal animals, but underneath it all was an absence of human noise so profound that it felt almost like pressure. The darkness outside the windows was absolute. I fell asleep thinking about why I'd come here. Not the official reasons I'd given Vera. The real reason was simpler and more devastating. I'd wanted to disappear, and now I had. October turned to November and the weather deteriorated into the kind of cold that feels personal. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The first snow came in the second week of the month, 12 inches overnight, and the world transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The forest became a study in black and white. The lake froze along its edges, ice forming in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost designed. I established a routine. Morning rounds checking the station's systems, midday trail maintenance and monitoring, evening radio check-in with the ranger station at park headquarters. Vera would answer, always professional, always brief. She'd ask if I'd had any visitor incidents or safety concerns. I would report that everything was secure. A minute of silence would follow while she documented my response. Then I was back to the isolation. The work was meditative. I repaired sections of trail, removed deadfall, and monitored hiking areas. I marked blazes on trees so visitors wouldn't get lost. I documented wildlife sightings, elk herds moving through the lower elevations, a grizzly that had lingered near the station in late September before moving on, deer that appeared at dusk to drink from the unfrozen section of the lake. But it was the silence that I came for, and the silence that kept me there. The longer I stayed, the less I missed human conversation, the less I thought about Denver and my old life. The mountains demanded presence in a way that nothing else ever had. By the middle of November, I was the only person within a 15-mile radius. Vera had warned me that this was normal. Park visitation dropped dramatically in autumn, and the remote areas cleared out almost entirely once winter weather began. If something happened to me, it would take time for anyone to know. Response times for true emergencies could stretch to 12 hours or more if weather was bad. I understood this and accepted it. It felt like freedom. The strange behavior started on a Tuesday evening, November 18th. I was on routine patrol near the northern end of the lake when I noticed deer tracks that didn't make sense. I'd been monitoring ungulate movements for weeks, taking detailed notes of patterns and populations. These tracks were wrong. There were 4 separate trails converging on a single point, and the prints themselves were oddly formed, pressed too deep into the earth even for the soft autumn substrate. The tracks led away from the water, toward a dense thicket of larch. I followed them for about 100 meters before the light began to fail. There was no carcass, no sign of distress. The tracks simply ended, circling back on themselves in patterns that looked almost confused. I marked the location on my map and made a note. Unusual ungulate behavior, possibly injured animal, possible predator activity. That night, something screamed in the forest. It wasn't a sound I recognized. Not a cougar, not a bear. The sound was too high-pitched, almost human, but not quite. It lasted for perhaps 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy and deliberate, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I lay in bed with my hand on the radio transmitter, considering whether to report it. But report what? That I'd heard a strange sound? Vera would ask me to describe it more clearly. I wouldn't be able to. She'd ask if I felt threatened or if there was an immediate emergency requiring response. The answer was no. I stayed quiet. The animal screaming occurred again 2 nights later, and then again on the 3rd night. Each time, it was a different location in the forest surrounding the station. The sound always came from deep in the woods, never close enough to clearly identify. The abrupt way it ended left me with the certainty that something was killing whatever made that noise. On November 23rd, I found the first body. I was clearing a section of trail near the lake's northern shore when I saw it. A mule deer, partially decomposed, positioned in the center of the path as though it had been deliberately placed there. The kill wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old enough to have lost all soft tissue. What disturbed me wasn't the state of decay, but the way the animal was arranged. All 4 legs were positioned unnaturally, folded under the body. The head was twisted at an angle that would have required breaking the neck, and the eyes had been removed, leaving dark sockets that stared upward at nothing. I photographed the site and marked it on my map. Predator activity, I wrote in my log. Unable to determine species, cause of death unclear, but I knew better. I'd studied enough field biology to recognize that no natural predator killed and displayed prey like that. Wolves brought down deer, but they consumed them. They didn't perform surgery on the corpse. They didn't position the remains for an audience. Over the next week, I found 3 more bodies, each one positioned along the trails I regularly walked, each one with the same careful mutilation, the eyes removed, the limbs arranged precisely, the head twisted. On the evening of November 30th, I made my radio check-in and asked Vera about predator activity in the region. "We get the usual," she answered. "Grizzlies, mountain lions, wolves." "Why?" "I've found several deer carcasses. The kills look unusual, predatory behavior I can't quite identify." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing through the static. "Describe what you're seeing," she said. I told her about the positioned bodies, the removed eyes, the broken bones. As I spoke, I heard her put me on hold. When she came back, her voice had changed. There was something in the tone that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully. "Sometimes animals exhibit predatory behaviors we don't fully understand," she said, "especially if there's competition for resources. What you're describing might be stress-related displays between competing predators. A way of marking territory." "That's not typically how they behave," I said. "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not." We both sat with that acknowledgement for a moment. "Be careful on your patrols," she said finally. "Don't approach any carcasses directly. Document them from a distance and report back to me. And if you encounter anything that makes you feel unsafe, you call it in immediately. Understood?" "Understood. I mean it," she said. "Some of the locals in Kalispell have stories about that area. I didn't think they were relevant before, but just be careful." The radio crackled with static. "What kind of stories?" I asked. "The kind that meant something to people for hundreds of years," Vera said. "The kind that warned them to stay in groups and not travel at dusk. The kind that suggested some things in those mountains shouldn't be approached or provoked." "That's not very specific." "No," she said. "But it's as much as I should be telling you. The rest, you'd need to hear from people who grew up with those stories. And they might not tell you. You're not from here." After we disconnected, I sat alone in the station watching the darkness settle over the lake. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft flakes that turned the world silent and white. I thought about why I'd really come to this place. I'd told myself it was for clarity, for escape, for some kind of redemption, but maybe it was something else. Maybe I'd been drawn here by the same force that had drawn me away from my old life, something that recognized something broken in me and knew this was the place I needed to be. The attack on the horses came on the second week of December. A group of backcountry outfitters operated near the park's western border, just outside my patrol range. They maintained a small camp with supplies and stock animals that they used for guided trips into the interior. I'd met one of them, a man named Rook, who managed the operation during my initial orientation. He'd seemed friendly enough, weathered in the way that comes from years working outdoors. He'd warned me that occasionally equipment would go missing from the camp and to watch for it on my patrols. Rook arrived at my station on a Wednesday morning, riding one horse and leading another. His face was drawn tight and there was a violence in his movements that suggested he'd ridden hard and fast to get here. "We had a kill," he said without preamble. "One of our stock, something I've never seen before." I made coffee while he composed himself. He drank it black and stared at the wall while he talked. "4 horses," he said. "We had them picketed in a grazing area about 3 miles from camp. Nothing fancy, just a small enclosure we use for short-term storage. I do rounds every 6 hours. At dawn when I checked, one of them was dead." "What took it?" "That's the problem," Rook said. "I don't know. The kill was too clean for a bear. There was no mauling, no frenzied predation. The animal was just separated from the others and executed." He paused, and I saw his jaw work as he fought to maintain composure. "And the way it was done was deliberate, like something with intent, something that knew what it was doing." I thought about the deer carcasses, the positioned bodies, the surgical precision of the injuries. "Did you see tracks?" I asked. "That's the worst part," Rook said. "The ground around the kill site was torn up. Hoof prints, which makes sense for panic. But underneath those, there were other tracks, human-shaped, or almost human. The foot configuration was off, too large, too wide, and there were claw marks alongside them." He pulled out a photograph on his phone and showed me. The image was slightly out of focus, taken in harsh sunlight that threw everything into sharp relief. I could see what he meant. The tracks were roughly foot-shaped, but with proportions that seemed wrong, as though they'd been made by something that was trying to walk like a human but couldn't quite get the mechanics right. And alongside each print, there were 3 parallel marks that suggested something with talons, with nails, with claws that had dragged through earth and stone. "How large?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Based on the prints, I'd estimate something between 6 and 8 feet tall. maybe 200 pounds or more. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The tracks circle the enclosure. Multiple times. It didn't attack immediately. It watched. It waited. It learned the layout of the situation before it killed. I handed back the phone and didn't respond for a moment. In the silence, I could hear the wind outside, the creak of the station walls as they settled against the cold. "You should report this to the ranger station," I said finally. "They'll want to assess the situation." "I did," Rook said. "Vera told me to contact the Wildlife Service and file a formal report. But she also said something else. Something that made me think I should come talk to you." "What's that?" "She said that if anything like this happened in your patrol area, you should know that there are people in town who could provide context. People whose families have been in these mountains for generations. People who might know what leaves those kinds of tracks." I met his eyes and held the gaze. "Do you know what's leaving those tracks?" Rook was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands, at the steam rising from his coffee, at anything but me. "I have theories," he said quietly. "My grandfather was Blackfeet. He grew up listening to stories about things that moved through these mountains, things that looked almost like people but weren't, things that hunted in ways that seemed intelligent. He called them—" Rook paused, and I saw him struggle with whether to continue. "He called them the ones who walk. He said they were older than the park, older than the reservation, that they'd always been here, and that people who respected the mountains knew to stay in groups and not travel after dark." "Skinwalkers?" I asked, using the Navajo term, though I knew it wasn't Blackfeet. Rook flinched slightly at the word. "Different tribes have different stories, but the concept is similar. Shape-shifting predators that can mimic human behavior, that use intelligence as a hunting strategy." He picked up his coffee again and drank deeply. "My grandfather said the best way to tell if something was one of them was to look at the joints. They could mimic the shape and movement of humans, but they couldn't quite get the knees right, or the elbows. There's always something slightly wrong with the way they bend." "That's folklore," I said, not unkindly. "Old stories meant to explain predators and to keep people cautious." "Maybe," Rook conceded. "But the prints I showed you, those were made by something real, something substantial enough to leave tracks in the earth, something that killed a horse with precision and intelligence. Folklore or not, we have a problem on our hands." He left shortly after, needing to get back to his camp before dark. I watched him ride away, back the way he'd come, moving quickly down the trail. That afternoon, I took my rifle and hiked to the site of the horse kill. The enclosure was exactly as Rook had described. A simple pasture ringed with fence posts and wire, located in a clearing near a water source. The ground was disturbed as he'd said, hoofprints scattered and panicked, and underneath those, clear as anything, were the tracks he'd shown me. I knelt beside one and studied it closely. The print was roughly foot-shaped, but the proportions were indeed wrong, too broad. The toes seemed to bend at angles that didn't match human anatomy. And the claws, Rook had been right about the claw marks. They were too large and too deliberate to be any animal I could identify, too precise for anything accidental. The horse's body was still visible, positioned near the fence line. It had been dead for at least 2 days and decomposition was beginning. But the wound that had killed it was visible on the left flank, a long, deep gash that went through the flesh and into the muscle beneath. The cut was clean, made by something with an edge sharp enough to slice through hide and sinew with minimal resistance. I photographed everything and made detailed measurements. Then I sat back on my heels and tried to process what I was seeing. The rational explanation was straightforward. There was a large predator in the park, something with behavioral patterns that didn't match known wildlife. The tracks suggested something with an unusual gait and claw configuration, perhaps a deformed animal, perhaps something rare enough that the Park Service wasn't fully aware of its presence. There were creatures in the remotest areas of the world that science was still discovering. Why not here? But as I sat there, looking at the tracks and the kill and the way the body had been positioned, I couldn't convince myself, because the precision of it suggested something worse than a deformed animal. It suggested intelligence, it suggested choice, it suggested predation conducted by something that thought. December arrived in full force. The temperatures dropped below 20 Fahrenheit consistently. The lake froze completely, and the forest became a landscape of extremes. Brilliant white snow against the dark timber. Silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat when I stayed still long enough. I increased my patrols, though I'm not sure what I was looking for. Evidence? Proof? The discovery of rationality in a situation that seemed increasingly irrational. The bodies piled up. More deer, a young bull elk, Two smaller predators that I couldn't fully identify, their remains scattered and dismembered. All positioned along the trails, all with the same deliberate arrangement, all marked with the same surgical precision. I wasn't afraid, not in the conventional sense. Fear requires a framework of understanding, and I had none. How do you be afraid of something you can't quite comprehend? Instead, I was suspended in a state of acute attention. My senses were hyperactive. Every sound in the forest seemed significant. Every shadow held the possibility of revelation. I started finding tracks near the station. The first time was December 15th. I was out doing morning rounds when I noticed disturbed snow directly beneath my bedroom window. The prints were large and deep, suggesting something heavy. The pattern was unmistakably human-like, but with the same wrongness I'd seen in the meadow. Something that had walked on two legs but not quite like a person walks. Something that had stood at my window, likely at night when I slept, looking in at the dark house. I checked my radio that evening and was tempted to report it. But report what? That something had walked near my station? That I'd found tracks that I couldn't explain? Vera would ask if I felt threatened. Was I threatened? The thing had come to the window but hadn't attempted entry. It had merely observed, the way Rook's predator had observed the horse enclosure. By December 20th, the tracks had become routine. The creature was circling the station every night, wearing a path in the snow as it moved around the structure. It was learning the layout, learning the distances, learning the terrain the way a stalking cat learns its hunting ground. The storm came on December 22nd. The weather reports had predicted heavy snow, but nothing had prepared me for the actual intensity of it. The system moved in at dusk and dumped 3 feet of snow by midnight. The wind was severe enough that it plastered the eastern-facing windows of the station with drifts, reducing visibility to nothing. The building creaked under the stress of the weather, and the generator had to work harder to maintain temperature. I used the day to inventory supplies. I was well stocked. Assuming the storm didn't stretch too long, I had enough food and fuel to survive comfortably for 3 weeks. If the storm lasted longer than that, rationing would become necessary, but supplies weren't really the concern. The concern was the storm was creating perfect cover. I could hear it moving around the station at night. The storm masked most of the sound, but occasionally there would be a crash or the sound of something heavy striking the walls. Once I heard what might have been a scratch against the wooden siding, long and deliberate, like something with claws drawn across the surface. I kept a fire going in the main room and didn't sleep much. I'd doze for an hour or two, then wake suddenly, my heart racing, convinced that I'd heard something that demanded immediate attention. Each time I'd grab the rifle and check the doors and windows, finding nothing but snow and darkness. On the third night of the storm, something tried the door. I was awake, sitting by the fire, when I heard the handle rattle. Not forcefully, experimentally, like something trying to understand how the mechanism worked. I grabbed the rifle and approached the door, not opening it, just standing behind it. The rattling stopped. For a few seconds there was silence. Then I heard something that might have been breathing, heavy and deliberate, on the other side of the barrier. "Go," I said, my voice strange in the silence. "Leave." The breathing stopped. The presence retreated from the door. I listened for the sound of movement in the snow, but the storm masked everything. I didn't sleep at all that night. On the fourth day, the storm began to clear. The snow stopped by afternoon, and the clouds started to break. By evening, I had partial visibility again. The snow lay heavy on everything, pristine and undisturbed, until I looked at the area around the station. The tracks were there. Dozens of them, circling the building, worn into shallow paths by repeated passage. Something had walked the perimeter of my shelter dozens of times while I sheltered inside. I followed the tracks into the forest, moving carefully, the rifle held loosely across my body. The prints led away from the station, deeper into the timber. I followed them for perhaps a quarter mile before something made me stop. Ahead, the forest opened slightly, creating a clearing visible through the trees. And in that clearing, I could see movement. A shape, a figure that was almost human but with proportions that were subtly wrong. It stood perhaps 200 feet away, perfectly still, watching me with an attention that I could feel like physical pressure. I should have been terrified. By all rational measures, I was facing something unknown and potentially lethal. But I felt oddly calm. I raised the rifle slowly, sighting down the barrel. The figure didn't move. It simply watched, its posture suggesting curiosity more than aggression. I could have taken the shot. The distance was well within the effective range of my rifle. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to end the uncertainty, to prove that whatever was hunting me was mortal, was killable, was subject to the same physical limitations as any other animal. But I didn't shoot. Instead, I lowered the rifle slowly and waited. The figure moved. Not running, not attacking, moving away, with a gait that was almost human but with a subtly wrong quality to the joint movements. Rook had been right about the knees. There was something wrong with the way they bent. The legs seemed to fold at angles that no human skeleton should support, but the movement was fluid, efficient, suggesting strength and control beyond what I could process. The figure disappeared into the timber, and I was alone again. I stood in the snow for a long time before turning back toward the station. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone, having decided against requesting supplies. The food I had was adequate. The cold was manageable. Isolation from human contact felt appropriate, like penance for something I couldn't quite name. But the creature had stopped hiding. It was in the open now, moving through the forest in daylight, never close enough to threaten but visible enough that I could see it when I looked. It would stand at the tree line watching the station. It would pace back and forth along the shore of the frozen lake. Once I saw it climb a tree with unsettling agility, moving through the branches with a kind of grace that no human could achieve. Despite the wrong angles of its limbs, I'd stopped being afraid. That's the strange thing about living with dread long enough. It becomes normal. The fear recedes, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. The creature was here. It was hunting me. I was hunting it, or at least cataloging it, documenting its behavior, trying to understand what it was. I had made the decision several days ago to stop calling for help. Vera would want to understand what was happening. She'd want to send personnel. And if I described what I'd seen, she'd either think I was insane or she'd believe me and recommend I evacuate. Either way, the isolation would end. My exile would end. And I'd have to return to the world I'd come here to escape. So I said nothing. I radioed my nightly check-ins with minimal information. All secure, no incidents, everything nominal. She seemed to sense something was wrong, her tone becoming more clipped, her questions more pointed. But she didn't press. Perhaps she knew that pressing would only drive me deeper. By New Year's Eve, I understood something fundamental. The creature wasn't trying to kill me. It had opportunities. It had come to my window. It had tried my door. It had watched me from the forest with clear intent. If it had wanted me dead, I would be dead. Instead, it was teaching me something. Every encounter was a lesson in predation. Every moment of watching was instruction in how to stalk and observe. The creature was sharing its knowledge with me. The way a parent teaches a child, the way an older animal teaches a younger one the rules of survival. I started leaving food outside, venison from one of the bodies I'd found, placed in a clearing visible from the station. The next morning, it was gone, not scattered by scavengers, not left to rot. Simply gone, consumed by something with standards about what it would eat and how. Rook came back on January 3rd, arriving without warning on a day that was cold and still. He was carrying supplies and looked troubled. "I'm closing the camp," he said immediately, taking the remaining stock out. "The Park Service is going to send a wildlife team to investigate, but I'm not waiting for them. Something isn't right here." "I know," I said. "You know?" He stared at me like I was infected. "The service thinks I'm overreacting. The initial autopsy report on the horse suggested natural predation. They're saying it was probably a large mountain lion and that they'll increase patrols. But they don't feel what's happening in this place." "No," I agreed. "They don't." "What do you feel?" Rook asked, and there was something desperate in his voice, like he was asking a holy man for interpretation. I tried to find words adequate to what I'd experienced. "I feel like something here has a purpose. It's not hunting out of hunger or territory. It's hunting out of, I don't know, intention, like it's trying to communicate something." "That's insane." "Probably," I said. Rook left after an hour. He took his horses, his equipment, his portion of whatever existed in the place. I didn't try to convince him to stay. He had obligations in the outside world. I no longer did. That night, the creature came closer than ever before. I was awake, as I always was, sitting by the fire. The door was locked, the windows secured. The rifle was beside me, loaded and ready, more for ritual than for genuine intent to use it. I heard scratching at the wooden siding. Not aggressive, deliberate, almost curious. The sound of something learning what wood felt like beneath its claws. I stood and approached the door, not opening it, just pressing my palm against the wood. Through the barrier, I could sense it on the other side. I could almost feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that transcended the physical. "What do you want?" I asked, not expecting an answer. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then I heard something that might have been breathing, or might have been wind, or might have been the creak of the building under stress. When I opened the door, the creature was standing 10 feet away in the snow. It was larger than I had thought from a distance, 7 feet tall at least. Its body was roughly humanoid, but with subtle wrongness in every proportion. The arms seemed slightly too long, the legs bent at angles that couldn't be right. The face was almost human, but with features that didn't quite align, like someone had tried to carve a human face from material that resisted the attempt. We looked at each other across the snowy ground, and in that moment, something shifted in my understanding. This wasn't a monster. It wasn't a creature of pure predation. It was something that existed on the margins of my understanding, something that had always been here, something that had perhaps come to believe in this place, in this moment, that contact might be possible. "I'm not leaving," I said quietly. It was very still. "They're coming," I continued. "The wildlife team. But I'm not going to tell them about you. I'm not going to help them find you. I don't know how to explain what happened next. Not telepathy exactly. Nothing so concrete. But it was like something passed between us. An understanding, an acknowledgement. You've been here before humans came," I said. "You were here before the park, before the reservation, before any of us knew what this place was." The creature turned, slowly, deliberately, and moved back into the forest. It didn't run, it didn't hide. It simply returned to the darkness between the trees, and I was alone again. I closed the door and sat by the fire for the rest of the night. When the wildlife team arrived 3 days later, they found nothing. No unusual tracks, no evidence of large predation, just a remote ranger and the vast loneliness of the forest. Vera asked if I was certain about my initial reports. I told her I'd been mistaken. Stress, isolation, the human mind creating patterns where none existed. She seemed to accept this with something that might have been relief or disappointment. It was hard to tell, but in the weeks that followed, I understood what had really happened. The creature had come to teach me about the margins of the world, about the places where understanding breaks down, and something else exists, about why certain places demand respect, about why some forests are meant to be walked through only in groups, only in daylight, only with the knowledge that you are a guest in a territory that predates your existence. The tracks continued near the station all winter. Never aggressive, simply present. Sometimes I'd leave food out and find it gone by morning. Sometimes I'd see the creature at the tree line, watching with an attention that suggested thought and consideration. I stopped counting the days until I could leave. The isolation that had seemed like escape now felt like something different. Like communion. Like finally understanding what it meant to exist at the margins of a world that never acknowledged the deepest wilderness. When spring came and the snow melted, the tracks disappeared. The creature had moved on, or had decided that its work with me was complete. But something had changed in me. Something that acknowledged the existence of things beyond human understanding. Something that respected the forest, not as a place to explore and document, but as a presence that predated and would outlive human conception. I requested a 3-year extension on my position. Vera approved it without question, and I stayed in the mountains, in the cabin by the lake, keeping the watch that had been kept here long before I arrived. Some places choose you. Some forests teach lessons that no human language can adequately describe. And sometimes, the most important moments of your life occur not in victory or defeat, but in the simple acknowledgement that you are not the highest intelligence in the room. I'm still here. The fire burns, the lake remains, and in the deepest hours of the night, when the forest is at its most alive, I sometimes hear something moving at the edge of the light. I no longer feel the need to investigate. I know what hunts in these mountains. I know what it wants, and I understand finally why I came. The cabin sat 3 miles from the nearest ranger station, perched beside Lake McDonald like something that had wandered there years ago and decided to stay. I'd been a park ranger for 8 years before taking this assignment, but never isolation like this. The posting came through in late August, just as the season was shifting towards something colder. Assistant ranger for the northern section of Glacier National Park, overnight monitoring duties, cabin accommodation provided. The pay was decent enough, but that's not really why I said yes. My ex-wife would probably say I was running from something. She'd be half right. What I was actually doing was running towards something I couldn't name, a pull I'd felt for years while working the busier sections of the park. The isolation called to me in a way I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding broken. There's a particular kind of silence that exists only in the deep wilderness, A silence that has weight and substance. I wanted to live inside that silence for a while. My name is Nashua Dakota to be precise. The Dakota comes from my mother's side, though that connection had grown thin by the time I was old enough to understand what it meant. Nashua is just what my parents named me when I was born in Missoula. I've never been particularly connected to either name, but they both felt right somehow when I was filling out the hiring paperwork, like they belonged to someone competent enough to live alone in the mountains. The cabin appeared on the last bend of the access road on September 1st. It was smaller than I'd expected, which meant fewer places for things to hide. And that seemed good to me then. The structure was solid timber, probably built in the 1970s, with a modern addition from maybe 15 years ago that housed a small laboratory. That lab was my real responsibility. I wasn't just there for traditional ranger duties. The park's wildlife division had been monitoring the fauna patterns in this section for the past 3 years, tracking everything from grizzly movements to bird populations. My job was to maintain the equipment, collect samples, record observations, and keep the isolation gear functional. The first week passed like something from a training video. I settled into routines, learned the creaks of the cabin, discovered that the heating system made a sound like distant machinery at midnight. The lake was beautiful in that way that makes you understand why people hike thousands of miles to see nothing but water and stone. I'd stand on the small dock attached to the cabin and watch the sun drop behind the peaks, painting everything the color of old blood. My supervisor, Derek, had driven up to help me get oriented. He was a good man, the kind that actually cared about the work instead of just collecting a paycheck. He walked me through the monitoring equipment, showed me how the sample collection worked, explained the tracking software on the laptop. "Anything unusual you see, you log it," he said, gesturing at a leather-bound journal on the desk. And I mean anything. Strange animal behavior, unexplained sounds, anything that doesn't fit the normal patterns. This section of the park is isolated enough that we want documentation on everything. "Unusual how?" I asked. Derek paused at the window, looking out toward the lake. "Just unusual. You'll know it when you see it. Trust your instincts. Rangers' instincts are usually right." He left on a Tuesday afternoon, driving back toward the main station with the kind of relief in his expression that told me he was glad to be leaving that much wilderness behind him. I watched his truck disappear around the bend, and then it was just me and the trees and the sound of wind moving through branches that had been standing in that exact spot for maybe 200 years. The job itself was meditative. Each morning I'd check the wildlife monitoring stations positioned around the lake perimeter, remote cameras, acoustic sensors, GPS tracking equipment. The data rolled in steady and consistent. Elk herds moving through the eastern valleys, black bears in the berry patches, the normal rhythm of a healthy ecosystem. In the evenings, I'd log observations, enter data, read through previous rangers' notes. That's where I found the first thing that made me uncomfortable. The previous ranger, someone named Marcus Webb, had kept meticulous notes. His handwriting was precise, almost compulsive in its attention to detail. Most entries were dry observations. Grizzly track, left side of North Trail, approximately 12 hours old. Likely female with cubs, paw prints measurable at 8 inches. Scat composition indicates recent fish consumption, but there were other entries, scattered throughout the year, usually with months between them. Sept 12. Heard something moving through the timber at the 0300. Not elk, not bear, couldn't identify. Sounded almost like running, human running, but wrong somehow. Nov 3. Something moved across the ice on the lake, too large to be anything cataloged. Stopped at the cove, listened for maybe 5 minutes, then moved north. I didn't look outside during this time, decided not to. Feb 18. Found tracks by the dock. Deer, not quite right. The spacing was wrong. The way they pressed into the snow was wrong. Like something very heavy trying to walk like something light. The final entry was dated March 2nd, exactly 1 week before Marcus apparently decided to quit. It's still here. I know it is. It comes when I'm not watching. The cabin feels different when it's been here. The air tastes different. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll tell them the isolation was too much, which is true in a way. This place is too much. I reread those entries 5 times, each time trying to construct a rational explanation. Bears could move strangely. Elk herds could sound wrong in the dark. Stress and isolation could do things to perception, but Marcus wasn't the kind of person to hallucinate problems. His other entries were brilliant in their precision and clarity. That night, I stayed awake longer than I should have, listening to every sound the cabin made. The heating system started its midnight groan right on schedule. Wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Something small, a rodent, probably, made noise in the walls. Everything had an explanation. Everything was normal. By October, I'd almost convinced myself that Marcus had simply suffered a mental breakdown, that isolation had worn on him in ways it wasn't wearing on me. I was built for this, I told myself. I was the kind of person who needed this. And it was true, I did. The silence, the routine, the daily contact with something larger than my own problems. I felt better than I had in years. Then I found the deer. It was October 18th, a Tuesday, when I discovered the carcass near the northern edge of the lake, about a mile and a half from the cabin. I was checking on one of the monitoring stations when I noticed the smell first. Not rotten, exactly, but off. Wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The deer was a mule deer, probably 3 years old, lying on its side in a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like a predation site. We had mountain lions in the region, and they could be efficient killers. But as I got closer, I realized the kill had happened at least 3 days prior, and the body hadn't been consumed. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the position of the corpse. The deer's head was twisted nearly completely backward, not like a lion had snapped its neck in that efficient way they did, but like something had actively rotated the skull against the spine, slowly, deliberately. The vertebrae were still visible where the fur had been torn away, and the damage pattern suggested the rotation had been performed post-mortem. There was very little blood, which meant the animal had died before the twisting happened. The third wrong thing was the tracks. There were multiple sets of prints around the body, and I documented them carefully with photographs and measurements. Some were clear, the larger paw prints of a cougar, maybe 150 pounds, passing through the area. Some were hoof prints from other deer. But there was a third set of tracks that made my stomach tighten. They were almost human. Almost. The prints showed 5 distinct toes. Definitely not a bear, which would have shown claw marks and a different stride pattern. The foot structure suggested bipedal movement, but the proportions were subtly off. The arch was too high, the heel too narrow, and the stride length changed constantly, as if something were struggling with the mechanics of walking on 2 legs. I measured each print carefully. The overall length was about 10 inches, which would suggest a human or something close to human. But the depth and the pressure distribution were all wrong. There was no natural weight progression from heel to toe. Instead, each print showed concentrated pressure at the heel and the ball of the foot, with almost nothing at the toe box. Like the creature was clenching its toes, gripping the ground. There were 7 of these strange prints circling the deer's body, then moving away toward the dense forest. They didn't follow any animal trail. They went straight through the underbrush in a direct line, and when I followed them for about 50 yards, they simply stopped. There was no indication of the thing that had made them jumping, climbing, or changing direction. It was just gone. I reported it to Derek as an unusual kill site, and he sent a wildlife biologist up to document the scene. She stayed for 4 hours, examined the carcass, photographed the tracks, and left looking both confused and skeptical. In her official report, she listed the cause of death as predation, large cat, and attributed the unusual killing pattern to possibly a young or inexperienced hunter practicing on kill site. As for the strange tracks, she noted them as likely environmental deformations and possible overlap of multiple deer hoof prints creating illusion of bipedal form. I knew better than to argue. But I also knew that wasn't what I'd seen. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 3 more bodies. An elk, partially hidden in a ravine, its legs bent at angles that would require breaking multiple bones. A black bear, young and healthy, lying in a stream with no marks of injury, its mouth open like it had died mid-scream. Another deer, this one more recent, found hanging from a low tree branch by something that wasn't a rope or sinew. I never determined what had suspended it. Each carcass was surrounded by those same strange tracks. Each time, I documented everything meticulously. Each time, I sent the reports to Derek. Each time, he came back with increasingly vague responses that basically amounted to wildlife anomalies that weren't worth investigating further. Probably just predator activity in a new pattern, he wrote. Nothing unusual for this time of year, but it was unusual. It was very unusual. And something was hunting in Lake McDonald's northern section, and whatever it was, it didn't fit any category I'd ever studied. I started keeping watch at night. The cabin had a large picture window facing the lake, and I began sitting there after midnight with the interior lights off, watching the moonlit landscape for movement. The lake in October was beautiful in a desolate way. The water had turned dark, almost black. reflecting the mountains in a way that made the boundary between water and sky disappear. The shoreline became a series of indistinct shapes, and the forest was a solid wall of shadow. On the night of October 31st, I saw something move along the lakeshore about a quarter-mile away. It was large, much larger than any deer or bear. It moved with that same wrong stride I'd seen in the tracks, not quite walking, not quite loping. It paused at the edge of the water and seemed to look up at the mountains. Even at that distance, I could see that its proportions were deeply wrong. The way its limbs bent, the angle of its torso, the shape of what might have been a head. None of it matched anything in my mental catalog of wildlife. I grabbed the thermal camera from the equipment closet and tried to get a lock on it, but by the time the device booted up and acquired the image, the thing had moved back into the tree line. I got maybe 3 seconds of footage, a thermal signature that showed a bipedal form roughly 7 feet tall, with internal temperatures that seemed wildly irregular. The head region showed strange patterns, almost like the thing's brain was overheated compared to its body. When I reviewed the footage later, the patterns didn't match any animal I could reference. They didn't match human either. They were just irregular. Broken. November came with the first snow, and the world changed. The landscape became a series of white plains and dark forest boundaries. The lack of color made distances impossible to judge. Sound carried differently. Distant things sounded close, and I'd find myself turning toward noises that were miles away. The cold settled into the cabin through invisible cracks, and the heating system worked constantly, creating rhythms that matched my own sleep patterns until I couldn't distinguish between what I was hearing and what was just my body's response to the cold. I'd been sleeping in the main room by the window, which I justified as convenience for night observation. It was actually because I couldn't stand the idea of being in the bedroom, with my back to the window, unable to see. Something about that position made my chest tighten with a kind of fear I hadn't felt since childhood. The first real contact happened on November 7th. I was out checking a monitoring station about a mile north of the cabin, moving through timber that the fresh snow had rendered almost impassable. The station was a small plastic box mounted on a tree, housing acoustic sensors and motion-activated cameras. I was replacing the batteries when I heard a sound from deeper in the forest. It was a voice. Almost. Human voices have rhythm, modulation, a quality of intentionality. This wasn't that. It was a sound that wanted to be a voice but couldn't quite manage the mechanics. It was like listening to someone try to imitate speech while their mouth was full, but without the garbling. The sound was clear, each component distinct, but assembled wrong. The cadence was off, the tone wrong, the overall effect being something that made my hindbrain reject it completely. It happened 3 times. 3 attempts at communication that failed at the fundamental level. I left the monitoring station without replacing the batteries and walked back to the cabin in daylight, moving fast enough that I was gasping by the time I reached the door. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report. What would I say? I heard something trying to talk? Derek would pull me out immediately, get me evaluated for stress, probably recommend I never work alone again. Instead, I upgraded my documentation systems. I set up additional motion cameras on wider perimeters. I positioned acoustic monitors at different distances from the cabin. I started mapping the creature's apparent territory through track analysis and sighting patterns. What I was building was a picture of something that was using the territory in ways that almost made sense, but not quite. The thing moved between the 2 large valleys that bordered Lake McDonald in a pattern that suggested regular hunting circuits, but it didn't hunt efficiently. It would kill animals and leave them. It seemed to mark territory not by scent marking, but by simply being present. I'd find sites where it had stood for extended periods, usually on high ground or near water, just existing in those spaces, and it was getting closer to the cabin. The first time I was certain of this was November 12th. I'd set up a series of motion cameras in a half circle about 100 yards from the cabin's eastern wall. When I reviewed the footage that morning, I found 23 trigger events over the course of the night. Most were false positives, wind-moving snow, branches falling under ice weight, but 3 were not. The first clip showed the creature, clear enough that I finally got a decent image to study, approaching from the forest toward the cabin. It moved through the snow slowly, deliberately, stopping frequently. It was exactly as tall as I'd estimated, roughly 7 feet, but the anatomy was profoundly strange. Its limbs were too long for its torso, giving it a stretched quality. The head sat at an angle that seemed permanently tilted, like it was perpetually looking slightly upward. The footage was too dark to see facial features, but I could make out the suggestion of eyes that reflected the camera's infrared light back with too much brightness. In the second clip, taken 40 minutes later, it was circling the cabin. Not attacking, not attempting entry, just moving around the perimeter in that wrong-jointed walk. It paused outside the window where I'd been sitting, though I'd gone to bed by that point. It stood there for almost 15 minutes, and I couldn't shake the image that it was trying to see inside. The third clip showed it walking away toward the northern forest. It moved with more certainty than before, like it had finished whatever assessment it was conducting. I didn't sleep for 2 days. On the night of the 14th, something changed. The creature didn't come to the cabin. Instead, I heard it screaming. That's what I have to call it. A scream. But like the almost voice, it was wrong in crucial ways. The pitch was too high, then too low, wavering between registers like the thing producing it couldn't control its own vocal cords. It wasn't a predator's hunting cry or a territorial roar. It was a sound of distress, of something in acute pain or fear. It came from the northern forest, maybe 2 miles away. It screamed for perhaps 3 minutes, repeated in intervals that suggested the thing was fighting something, resisting something. Then it stopped, cut off mid-sound like the thing's throat had been severed. In the silence that followed, I realized I was holding my breath. My hands were shaking. I turned on every light in the cabin and sat until dawn, listening to the silence and knowing that whatever had made that scream, something else had stopped it. The morning after I heard the screaming, I made a decision. I was going to track this thing. Derek would have told me it was unsafe. The protocol was clear. Any wildlife that presented an active threat was to be reported and avoided until management could respond. But I'd been avoiding the real question for weeks. What was I actually dealing with? I packed a day bag with supplies, loaded my rifle with real ammunition instead of the tranquilizer rounds I usually carried, and set out into the northern forest following the path the creature had apparently been using. The ground was covered with 8 inches of fresh snow, which meant I'd have fresh tracks to follow if the thing had moved since the screaming. I found the blood about 2 miles in. It was spray pattern, significant volume, distributed across tree trunks and snow in a way that indicated massive arterial bleeding. I collected samples, photographed the scene from multiple angles, and followed the trail deeper into the forest. It led to a clearing where the snow was disturbed extensively. There were tracks of multiple animals here: elk, deer, black bear. There were also tracks of the creature, and something else. The other tracks were enormous. I'm not a biologist, but I've spent enough time in wilderness to know predator signs. These were paw prints, roughly 16 inches across, deeper than any black bear's could be. The spacing suggested something that moved slowly but with tremendous power. Grizzly? Possibly, but I've never heard of a grizzly this far north in winter, and the track pattern was wrong for any bear I'd ever studied. What I was looking at was the aftermath of a conflict between 2 large predators. Following the second set of tracks led me to a ravine I hadn't marked on my mental maps. The creature I'd been tracking had apparently run or been driven toward this drop-off, and the massive predator had pursued it. I found blood scattered along the rim and continued down the slope. What I found in that ravine haunts me still. The creature was dead. I knew that immediately. It lay in a contorted position against rocks that jutted from the ravine floor, and there was damage across its body that suggested a catastrophic fall and significant predation. But I could study it now, examine it in a way I hadn't been able to before. It was roughly 7 feet tall, weighing what I estimated to be around 300 pounds. Its body composition suggested a bipedal existence. The legs were powerful and built for upright movement, the arms long and strong but adapted for balance rather than knuckle walking. The feet were distinctly unusual. 5 toes, yes, but they were long and jointed in ways that suggested the creature could probably manipulate objects with its feet. The torso showed evidence of the predation that had killed it. Deep wounds, probably from teeth, covered the abdomen and chest, but what struck me most was the evidence of prior injury. This creature bore scar tissue from at least a dozen previous wounds. It had been a survivor, a fighter, something that existed in constant conflict with its environment. The head was what I spent the most time examining. The structure was almost humanoid, but not quite. The jaw was slightly oversized, suggesting powerful bite force. The nasal cavity was larger than a human's, suggesting heightened smell. But the eye sockets were positioned slightly further apart than they should be, and the orbital structure suggested the creature had vision adapted for low-light environments. I wanted to take a sample, preserve something, create evidence, but I also knew that doing so would require explaining what I'd found, and I had no explanation that would be believed. No one would accept what I was looking at. They'd say it was a deformed bear or a diseased elk or some other mundane explanation that would allow them to move past the implications. Instead, I documented everything with photographs. I recorded measurements. I drew detailed sketches of the anatomical structure. Then I carefully backed away from the corpse and left it in that ravine, a secret I carried alone. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I spent 4 hours entering data into my private logs, separate from the official wildlife monitoring documentation. I created a comprehensive file with my theories, my observations, my evidence, not the measurements or photographs. Those I kept separate, hidden, but my interpretations, my timeline, my attempt to make sense of what was happening in this forest. The next morning, I received an email from Derek. The servers came and went through spotty satellite connection, and I saw that Derek had been trying to reach me for 2 days. "We're getting concerned about you," the email said. "Multiple hikers have reported seeing something unusual in the northern section of the park, something large, apparently bipedal. Wildlife management is going to send a team up to investigate. Can you provide any information about recent activity in your area? Also, one of the hikers mentioned hearing an animal screaming in the night around November 14th. Were you monitoring anything unusual?" I read the email 3 times, then I deleted it, which I shouldn't have done, but I did anyway. Someone else had seen something. Someone else knew there was something in this forest, and management was going to respond, which meant they would find the body eventually, which meant questions I couldn't answer. The team arrived on November 19th. There were 4 of them. Derek, a veterinary pathologist named Morrison, 2 hunters from the State Wildlife Commission. I met them at the cabin and did what I was trained to do. I briefed them on recent observations, pointed them toward the areas I'd been monitoring most closely, and didn't mention the corpse in the ravine. They searched for 5 days. They found the strange tracks, they found the kill sites. They hypothesized about predators and environmental stress and disease patterns. Morrison was particularly interested in the track anomalies, spending hours photographing them and consulting with specialists via satellite connection. On the 3rd day, he took me aside and asked me point-blank if I'd been hallucinating anything. "The stress of isolation," he said carefully, "can create perceptual patterns that seem real but are actually manifestations of—" "I'm not hallucinating," I said. He studied me for a moment. "Okay. Then what do you think you're seeing?" I should have told him. I should have taken him to that ravine and shown him the corpse. Should have presented my documentation and theories and let someone with actual expertise examine the evidence. But I didn't, because I understood something that no field manual ever covers. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth. They found the body on the 4th day. They left shortly after, taking the carcass with them for analysis. What followed was 2 weeks of silence. Then an email from Derek notifying me that the specimen had been identified as a deformed black bear, probably diseased, that had suffered a significant fall and predation wounds. "Case closed," Derek wrote. "Morrison wants to talk to you about some stress leave, but I told him you've been solid. The official report is filed. I'd recommend you finish out your assignment as scheduled." The assignment was contracted through March. It's now February, and I have 43 days left. I don't go into the forest much anymore. I maintain the equipment, collect the data, do my job. But I spend most of my time inside the cabin, watching the lake, waiting for something that hasn't returned since November. Because the thing they found in that ravine wasn't the only one. That creature had been prey in the end, something larger, something that could defeat it. Something I never got a clear look at was what actually killed it. That thing is still out here. I've analyzed my observations, reviewed my data, examined the photographs from that first November sighting. I've spent countless hours staring at the track measurements, trying to build a phylogenetic framework for what I was looking at. The conclusion I've reached is one that I can't communicate to anyone because it implies something that contradicts everything we think we know about the fauna of North America. But the tracks didn't lie. The kills didn't lie. The body I examined didn't lie. There is something in Glacier National Park that shouldn't exist, something that might not be entirely animal or entirely human, but something else entirely. Something that hunts at night and moves through the forest with intelligence that suggests awareness of observation. Something that tried to study my cabin the way I was studying it. 2 creatures examining each other across a gap of comprehension neither of us could bridge. I accepted this posting because I needed the silence, because I needed to disappear into wilderness and let the modern world lose track of me. I found exactly what I was looking for, isolation so complete, so absolute, that reality itself becomes negotiable. Out here, things can exist that don't fit into civilized categories. Out here, the rules that govern the wider world have less authority. 43 days. Then I get to decide if I ever come back. I haven't decided yet. The lake is beautiful today. The ice is thickening, and under certain lights it's clear enough to see down to the rocks below. Sometimes I watch it and wonder what lives in those depths, what creatures might thrive in cold, dark water away from observation, building lives we'll never understand. I wonder if that's where the other one is hiding, waiting, learning, watching back. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear, not in the romantic sense that draws people to wilderness work, not because I wanted to find myself or reconnect with nature. I needed to physically remove myself from a situation in Denver that had spiraled into something I couldn't control. A relationship had imploded. My professional reputation at the environmental agency had been collateral damage in the fallout. My apartment lease was ending. Everything aligned to make leaving not just possible but necessary. The Park Service posted a late-season ranger position for the Northern Zone, based out of a remote research station near Lake McDonald's eastern shore. November through March. 9 months of relative isolation, managing trails, monitoring wildlife populations, and staffing the small ranger cabin that served as a field station. The position required someone capable of working alone for extended periods, someone comfortable with limited contact, someone willing to be the sole authority for 60 square miles of backcountry. I was that person, whether I wanted to be or not. My supervisor during training was a grizzled man named Victor who had worked the same station for 17 years. He met me at the West Glacier entrance in early October, driving a green truck with more rust than paint. During the drive to the station, he explained the basics without looking at me. The cabin had been built in 1987 as a research outpost. It had reliable power from a generator, a water system fed from a spring, and a radio that worked when the weather cooperated. The trails in the zone had light traffic even in summer, virtually none in winter. "You'll be alone most of the time," Victor said, navigating the rough service road. "That's not a metaphor. You'll go weeks without seeing another person." "That sounds good," I said. Victor glanced at me. "Most people find it harder than they think." The cabin appeared at dusk, nestled between old-growth Douglas fir and western larch trees that had already lost most of their needles. It was smaller than I expected, built from wood that had weathered to a soft gray. A narrow porch faced east toward the lake, barely visible through the forest at that hour. Smoke rose from the chimney. "You'll want to keep the fire going through the winter," Victor said, pulling supplies from the truck. "The generator runs the essentials, but the wood stove is better for day-to-day, more consistent heat." The interior was sparse but functional. A main room with a cast-iron stove. A small kitchen with a gas range and propane refrigerator. 2 bedrooms, one that Victor had used as a secondary storage room, a bathroom with a composting toilet. Books lining the shelves in the main room, mostly wildlife field guides and topographic maps. A large radio telephone unit dominated one corner desk with a logbook beside it where rangers recorded daily observations and station activities. Victor walked me through the procedures. Daily radio checks at 0800 and 1800 hours, the emergency frequencies, the supply rotation schedule, the routes that saw the most traffic, the areas that rarely received visitors. He showed me the trail markers, the bridges that required regular maintenance, the sections that experienced seasonal flooding. By the time he finished, darkness had settled completely around the cabin. Through the windows, the forest was nothing but varying densities of black. "One more thing," Victor said before leaving. He was standing at the door, his hand on the frame. "The previous ranger before I took over long-term lasted about 4 months out here. It was 1987. He reported some unusual activity in the northwest section near the old logging roads. Said he heard vocalizations at night that didn't match any native wildlife. Saw scat that wasn't clearly identifiable. Found scat patterns that suggested something large was moving through at night." I waited. He also said he saw something on a trail once. Something that walked upright but not quite like a human. He filed a report, requested a transfer, and was gone by Christmas. Victor paused. "The official record is that he found the isolation too difficult, but that's not why he left." "You believe what he reported?" I asked. "I believe he saw something that frightened him enough to abandon a job. Whether that something was an undocumented animal or his own mind fragmenting under stress, I honestly don't know. But in 17 years I haven't seen it. I've heard strange sounds, sure, but I've heard strange sounds every winter. I've learned to distinguish between what's actually in these woods and what my brain generates when it's dark and quiet and I'm alone." He left an hour later, after the propane heater had warmed the cabin to a comfortable temperature. I watched his truck's taillights disappear into the forest. Then I was alone. That first night, I sat by the stove and read the logbooks from the previous rangers. Victor's entries were methodical and dry. Weather observations, maintenance completed, occasionally a note about animal tracks. The entries before his, from the previous ranger, grew increasingly fragmented as autumn turned to winter. They began with standard observations but gradually filled with questions. Unidentified sounds at 0230 hours, large canine scat with unusual morphology, possibly ursine. Thermal imaging detected movement in Sector 5 that didn't correspond to any known ungulate patterns. The last entry read, "Heard it again. Knew it was coming. Didn't go outside." The date was December 19th, 1987. There were no entries after that. I told myself the man had left because of the isolation, because his mind had fractured under the pressure of being alone in winter, because the wilderness had leaned on him until he broke. I wasn't running from wilderness. I was running toward it. There was a difference. The first 2 weeks passed quietly. I fell into the rhythm of the station easily, perhaps because falling into routines was easier than thinking. I maintained the trail system, cleared debris, monitored the snow levels, and made my radio checks without variation. I read extensively. I cooked simple meals. I became familiar with the cabin's particular sounds, the way the wind moved through different parts of the building, how the generator's hum changed depending on the load. By late October, the weather had turned cold enough that snow began accumulating at higher elevations. The radio, which I'd listened to mostly out of habit, crackled with reports from other stations in the park. Everything normal, wildlife moving into winter ranges, seasonal closures of popular trails, a search operation for a lost hiker near the summit trail, resolved when they found the man 6 miles off course, hypothermic but alive. That search was handled by stations far to the south. My zone remained quiet. On November 1st, I was clearing fallen branches from the eastern approach trail when I heard the voices. I was approximately 3 miles from the cabin, moving methodically with a handsaw and a pack for collecting debris. The day was clear and cold, around 32 degrees. The forest was dense with larches that had turned gold before shedding their needles, creating an almost barren appearance that was somehow more isolating than green density would have been. The voices came from the north, off-trail, moving toward the main path. I stopped working immediately. Visitors were not common, especially this late in the season, and they were virtually non-existent in areas off the established routes. I secured my tools and moved closer to listen, not sure if this was a situation requiring assistance or something to simply document. A man's voice strained. "I don't recognize any of this. We should have hit the loop trail by now." A woman's voice, calmer. "We went past the fork. Keep north." They emerged from the tree line 15 minutes later, and I could see the problem immediately. They were underdressed, moving with the careful slowness of people who were exhausted. The man was in his 60s, wearing only a fleece jacket and jeans. The woman, who I assumed was his wife, wore similar inadequate clothing. Both carried small day packs. "You're off the maintained trail system," I called out, approaching carefully so as not to startle them further. They both jumped, which told me they were more disoriented than I'd initially assessed. "Thank God," the woman said. "We took what we thought was the main trail from the lodge, but we must have missed a turn. We've been walking for 5 hours. I knew immediately where they'd gone wrong. There was an unmarked fork near the lodge access that looked like it might continue the popular loop. It actually led to an old maintenance road that had been abandoned for 15 years. Tourists made the mistake maybe twice a season. "My name is Dakota," I said. "I'm the ranger for this sector. You're about 4 miles from where you started, heading deeper into backcountry. The good news is I can guide you back. The better news is you found me instead of wandering until dark." I didn't mention the news that November temperatures dropped below freezing at night. I didn't mention that adequate clothing in this area wasn't a preference. It was the difference between living and dying. The couple was incredibly grateful. We began the return journey immediately, moving at their pace, which was considerably slower than my usual travel speed. The woman, who introduced herself as Rebecca, stayed alert and tried to help with navigation. The man, whose name was Jack, was clearly suffering from both exhaustion and the early stages of hypothermia. He was shaking, his conversation growing slower and more monotone. "How much further?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. "About 3 miles, I said, and looked at Rebecca. "He needs to move faster, but he needs to keep his core temperature up. We need to get him to the cabin where it's warm." We picked up the pace. Jack protested mildly but complied. The sun was already dropping toward the western peaks, and I was acutely aware that we had maybe 90 minutes of usable daylight. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the thing that scared me most about that day, but it was the beginning. A sound from deeper in the forest, north of where we were walking, that didn't belong to any animal I could identify. It was large. Something was moving through the underbrush with tremendous weight, tearing through deadfall without attempting stealth. I stopped walking. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered. "Probably a bear," I said, which was technically true. It could be a bear. Bears still roamed these forests, even in late autumn. "We need to make noise as we walk. Talk, don't be quiet. Bears don't want contact with people." But I was wrong. Something was wrong about the sound, about the way the thing was moving. Bears gave themselves away with location, with recognizable behaviors. This was different. The movement wasn't random search. It was parallel to our position, matching our pace, staying 30 or 40 yards off to our left. We walked faster. The sun dropped lower. Jack's breathing became labored, but he didn't complain again. The cabin appeared through the trees at dusk, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. I got Jack and Rebecca inside, and immediately got a fire going in the stove, wrapped Jack in blankets, and made hot tea. "You probably saved our lives," Rebecca said from the kitchen. I was starting to get worried about hypothermia. I nodded, listening to the forest beyond the walls. The sound had stopped once we reached the cabin. Whatever had been in the woods had ceased its pursuit, but it hadn't gone away. I was sure of that. Jack and Rebecca stayed at the cabin for 2 nights. I called in their location once they were stable, and a ranger from the main station was supposed to pick them up the following day. Due to weather moving in faster than forecast, the pickup was delayed. During those 2 nights, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire burning and sat in the main room with a view toward the dark windows listening. The sounds started around 0200 hours. They were subtle at first, sounds that could be explained away as wind or normal forest activity. But they had a quality to them that made the back of my neck respond instinctively. Careful sounds, deliberate sounds. Something was walking around the cabin perimeter. Jack was asleep in one of the bedrooms, his breathing steady and increasingly healthy. Rebecca had insisted on staying up with me, claiming she wasn't tired, but really because she could sense what I sensed, that something had followed us out of the woods and knew where we were. "There's nothing out there," she said quietly, but it was a question. "Probably just nocturnal activity we wouldn't normally notice," I said. "You get used to it." But at 0230 hours we heard the sound Victor's predecessor had reported in the logbook. It came from the north side of the cabin, from the direction of the lake. It was a vocalization, but not one that fit into any category I could easily define. It wasn't a growl or a howl or a roar. It was something between a human voice and an animal sound, something that hit the ear wrong, something that made the body want to respond to a threat that the brain couldn't clearly identify. Rebecca made a small sound, something between a gasp and a suppressed shout. "It's just an animal," I said, and I heard the uncertainty in my own voice. The sound didn't repeat, but the sense of presence did. We heard movement, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin's perimeter. It came from the north, moved to the east, then appeared to circle around to the south. Twice, something heavy pressed against the structure, testing it, the way an animal might investigate an unfamiliar object. At 0400 hours, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sounds had been. Jack emerged from his room at first light, asking for more tea. He didn't seem to have heard anything, which meant he'd actually slept or the sounds hadn't penetrated deeply enough to wake him. The pickup came at 0900 hours. A ranger named Devon showed up in a Park Service vehicle with chains on the tires. He checked Jack's condition, asked what I'd seen on the trail, made a note in his clipboard, and agreed it had been the right call to get them to shelter immediately. I didn't mention the sounds. As he was leaving, Devon paused. "You're not going to last long out here if you're the type to spook easy," he said, not unkindly. "I'm not spooked," I said. He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe me. After they left, the cabin felt different. Emptier. The absence of other humans made the surrounding forest seem closer, as if the walls had lost some quality of protection in the night. I pulled out the logbooks again and read through the previous ranger's entries more carefully. December 12, 1987. Heard movement around the perimeter at night. Sounded large. Could hear it testing the foundation. Stayed in the interior room. December 15, 1987. It's still there. I can feel it. I've stopped opening the curtains. It knows we're here. December 19th, 1987. Heard it again. Knew it was coming. Didn't go outside. December 19th, 1987. Heard it again, knew it was coming, didn't go outside. There was no December 20 entry. The ranger had abandoned the station 2 days later. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, though I knew that was more psychological comfort than practical protection. Locks wouldn't stop something large enough to test the cabin's foundation, but the ritual of checking them, of ensuring they were secure, made the night feel slightly more manageable. The sounds came again at 0200 hours. This time there was no attempt at stealth. Whatever it was came directly toward the cabin from the north, moving fast, and slammed into the eastern wall hard enough to rattle the windows. I was on my feet instantly, the logbook falling from my lap. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and stood in the center of the main room listening. Silence. But the silence was filled with waiting. Something was out there, and it knew I was in here. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the fire burning high, every light in the cabin on, the radio volume set high enough that I'd hear any emergency broadcasts. I was listening so intently for sounds outside that I almost missed the scratching. It came from the roof, toward the peak. Slow, deliberate scratching, like something with claws testing the integrity of the shingles, or like something trying to find a way in. The logbook lay open on my lap where I'd retrieved it. December 12, December 15, December 19. The dates repeated in my head like a mantra. The scratching continued sporadically for 3 days. I maintained my radio checks and documented what I was experiencing in the logbook, using the same dry, measured language the previous rangers had employed. Perhaps they had learned, as I was learning, that putting fear into words made it more real, so they kept their language clinical. Unexplained sounds, northern approach. Subject appears to be large, nocturnal. Behavior suggests territorial investigation rather than direct threat assessment. By the 6th day of the cycle, I had a comprehensive theory forming in my mind. The previous ranger had encountered something that had remained in these woods for decades, that tested the cabin, that moved at night with a distinct pattern, something that was intelligent enough to test structures for weakness, that circled to understand the layout, that came back repeatedly because it understood what the cabin meant. Shelter, and the presence of food in the form of humans. The question was, what was it? Bear behavior could explain much of it. Bears test structures. They're intelligent enough to understand that humans mean food. But bears don't make sounds that don't fit bear categories. Bears have established patterns that other biologists can recognize and document. Something else had moved through this forest since at least 1987. Something that had driven away anyone who encountered it long enough to truly understand it. On the 7th night, I made a decision that I now understand was the moment everything changed. I was sitting by the stove around 2100 hours when I heard it coming again, the familiar slow approach from the north. Instead of retreating, instead of making noise to scare it off, instead of hiding in the interior room and pretending it didn't exist, I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the front door. Rebecca had asked what I'd heard in the woods. The logical answer was bear. The truthful answer required confrontation. The figure was perhaps 40 feet from the cabin, barely within the reach of my flashlight beam, and everything in my body told me that what I was seeing was wrong. It was large, possibly 7 or 8 feet tall, but that wasn't the wrongness. The wrongness was the shape. It was roughly humanoid, roughly upright, but the proportions were off. The arms were too long, the shoulders were too broad, the head was elongated, and it was standing in the direct beam of my flashlight, unafraid, watching me. I should have been terrified. I should have slammed the door and barricaded myself inside. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. What do you want? It didn't answer. It couldn't answer. But it tilted its head in a way that suggested it understood the question, that it had been expecting this conversation for days, that it was almost curious to see what I would do now that I'd acknowledged its presence. Then it turned and walked away, back toward the dark forest, moving with a gait that was both familiar and utterly alien. I stood in the open doorway for perhaps 3 minutes after it disappeared, my hands shaking from something I couldn't identify as fear or excitement or some third thing that didn't have a name. When I came back inside and closed the door, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The previous ranger had run. I had confirmed that the thing was real, that it was intelligent, and that it had chosen not to end this interaction when it easily could have. I opened the logbook and wrote, "Observation documented. Subject is bipedal, approximately 7-8 feet in height, humanoid but with significant anatomical anomalies. Subject did not display overtly aggressive behavior. Subject appeared to be aware of my presence and responded to direct confrontation by withdrawing. Possible explanation: territorial animal defending established range. Recommendation: caution during nocturnal activities. Subject may become habituated to human presence at this location and escalate contact attempts. I read those words back and understood that I was documenting my own descent into something that looked like madness but felt increasingly like clarity. Winter came early and hard that year. By the third week of November, the elevation where the cabin sat received 22 inches of snow. The forest roads became impassable. The weekly supply runs stopped. I was truly alone, with a cabin full of food and fuel and the knowledge that something had established a long-term pattern of interaction with whoever occupied the structure. The thing returned on November 24th. This time it came during daylight, moving through the trees with the same careful deliberation but without the nighttime caution. I watched it from the cabin window, a large dark shape moving between the larches, and I felt something shift in my understanding. It wasn't hunting me, it was investigating me. The way a scientist investigates an interesting problem. That night, I opened the door again. It was there, waiting, as if it had known I would. This time I saw it more clearly. The face was the most disturbing part, almost human but stretched. The features arranged in a way that suggested it was trying to mimic human structure and failing in significant ways. It looked at me with eyes that held intelligence, intention, and something that might have been loneliness. "You've been here a long time," I said aloud, and it's impossible to explain the certainty I felt that it understood. It made a sound then, that vocalization that didn't fit categories. It was almost words, almost language, almost something it was trying desperately to communicate. It was the sound of something intelligent trapped in a form that couldn't speak, that could only circle and test and push against the boundaries of its own existence. I understood then why the previous ranger had left. It wasn't fear of violence, it was fear of comprehension. Fear of standing at this exact moment and understanding that this thing was not an animal, not a creature, not something that could be explained away as wildlife misidentification. It was something that had learned to live in these mountains, that had learned the territory so completely it might as well have been born here. And it was reaching out, trying to establish some kind of communication with the first human who had been willing to look at it directly. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. It came to the cabin most nights. I opened the door. We stood in silence while it attempted, unsuccessfully, to make language happen in that throat that wasn't built for human speech. Sometimes I spoke to it, telling it about the world outside these mountains, about the park, about the rangers and the tourists and the seasonal patterns that govern these woods. It listened. I became convinced it understood most of what I said. By December, the snow was too deep for the supply vehicle to reach me. I wasn't concerned. I had provisions. And I had something else now, something the previous ranger hadn't had. A choice. I could have requested emergency evacuation. There were codes for that, procedures I could have activated. But I understood that doing so would mean the end of whatever this was. This thing that had managed to exist in these mountains for decades without being definitively documented, without being studied, without being killed. On December 19th, exactly 36 years after the previous ranger's last logbook entry, I wrote, "Subject has developed consistent patterns of approach and interaction. No aggressive behavior documented. Possible explanation: terrestrial primate species, undocumented, displaying high intelligence and tool understanding. Have established safe interaction protocols. Subject appears to have resolved initial territorial aggression and moved to investigative phase. Winter population may be stable. Recommend minimal interference and continued observation." I stopped updating the logbook after that. What was the point? The Park Service would find them eventually, when the snow melted or supply routes reopened. They would read my documentation and understand that I had lost my mind, had anthropomorphized wildlife into a narrative of intelligence and intention. Or they would understand that I had finally, after running so far and so deliberately into isolation, discovered something worth understanding. The winter deepened. The thing that visited my door became more regular, more present. I started leaving food outside, not offering it ceremonially, but simply leaving it where it would be found. Once, I found fresh deer carcass outside the cabin, positioned on the porch where I would find it. An exchange, a gift. I named it Dakota, after the old Lakota word, which is what I'd given as my own name when the Park Service hired me. It felt right that we should share something of identity, that whatever this moment was between us should be marked by a doubled name. On January 15th, when the rescue team finally managed to reach the cabin, they found me in good health. with adequate food stores, with documentation that appeared to be increasingly detailed descriptions of bear behavior. "We're evacuating you immediately," the station commander said. "It's protocol when a ranger has been this isolated." I didn't resist. I packed my belongings. I left the logbook on the desk, knowing they would read it and dismiss it. As we were leaving, I saw Dakota at the forest edge, watching from the darkness between the trees. Our eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds, and I tried to communicate in that moment what I had tried to communicate all winter. That I understood, that I knew, that I wouldn't tell them in any way they would believe. The cabin was locked up. New procedures would be implemented. No more single rangers stationed in the remote zones. The position I held would be restructured, staffed differently, made safer. I was debriefed, evaluated, cleared as psychologically stable, though with recommendations for extended leave to recover from the isolation. I took the job knowing I'd have to disappear. I discovered that disappearance came in many forms, and that sometimes the cost of understanding was that nobody else ever could. Dakota is still in those mountains, still testing the boundaries of its existence in that land between animal and something more, still waiting perhaps for the next ranger willing to open the door. I dream about it sometimes, about those winter nights and that dark face trying desperately to become human. And I wonder if it dreams too, if it remembers, if somewhere in those vast forests it carries the memory of being seen, being heard, being almost understood. The Park Service filed my report under psychological stress responses to isolation and moved on. New rangers were assigned to the northern zone in the fall. They came with better training, better equipment, better mental health preparation. None of them reported anything unusual, but I know what's waiting for them in those woods. I know it's been waiting for years, and I know that someday, someone will open that cabin door and finally accept what stands waiting in the dark. They just need to be willing to listen. My name is Inoki, and I've spent the last 4 years running away from a life that no longer fit me. The job posting for a seasonal ranger position at Glacier National Park arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Friday I'd signed the contract. My former colleagues at the environmental consulting firm in Seattle asked if I was taking a sabbatical. I told them I was, though we all knew the truth. A promotion I didn't want, a relationship that had curdled into resentment, and a creeping sense that the city was slowly replacing something essential in my chest with static. These things had conspired to make leaving feel like survival. Glacier offered something concrete. There would be trails to maintain, tourists to guide, equipment to check, real work with visible outcomes. The mountains themselves seemed to promise a kind of honesty that office life had never delivered. I had spent my 20s studying ecosystems, writing reports about climate change and habitat loss, watching forests die through data on spreadsheets. Now I wanted to stand in them again, to smell the wet stone and pine, to feel small in a way that was clarifying rather than paralyzing. The park assigned me to patrol a section of the Northwestern Territory, a remote area accessible primarily by foot. My station was a 2-room cabin built in 1987, positioned on the eastern shore of Gunsight Lake, roughly 14 miles from the nearest trailhead. The cabin had been updated in 2015 with propane heating and a satellite phone, but it still held the smell of every ranger who'd spent a winter there before me. Damp wood, smoke, coffee that had gone cold in tin cups. My supervisor, a man named Desmond with the weathered face of someone who'd never left the mountains, drove me there in late May. We traveled by truck to the trailhead, then hiked the 14 miles with my supplies packed into panniers slung across a rented mule. Desmond talked about the job in practical terms. Radio checks every evening at 6, report any signs of distressed wildlife or unauthorized hikers, maintain the 3 marked trails in the sector, monitor the cabin's water system, don't be a hero if something goes wrong. People underestimate the wilderness, he said during one of our breaks, sitting on a fallen log while the mule grazed nearby. They think the danger is mostly bears and slips on rocks. But up here, the real problem is what happens to your mind when you're alone long enough. Your brain starts telling you things that aren't there. You get to know the sounds so well that anything different becomes a threat, just something to be aware of. I'd nodded, thinking I understood. I'd never truly understood. The cabin emerged from the tree line just before sunset. Gunsight Lake stretched out before it like something from an old painting, the water so clear that the stone bottom was visible 30 feet from shore. The peaks surrounding the basin were still crowned with snow, even in late May. The silence was profound. I remember setting down my pack and just breathing, feeling the knot in my chest begin to loosen. That first week, I inventoried supplies and refamiliarized myself with the 3 patrol trails. The northern route climbed through alpine meadows and descended to a viewpoint overlooking a glacial cirque. The eastern trail wound through dense lodgepole forest before emerging at a rocky ridgeline. The southern route was the shortest, a 3-mile loop through mixed conifer forest that ended at a secluded waterfall. I walked them all, making notes about erosion, fallen trees, and places where the path had become unclear. The days settled into a rhythm. I'd wake early, before the light got good, and make strong coffee on the propane stove. I'd check the radio, complete whatever maintenance task Desmond had assigned, then spend the afternoon on patrol. The evenings belonged to myself. I read. I wrote in a journal that I told myself was for documenting trail conditions but was really just me trying to remember how to think outside the noise of constant connection. By mid-June, I'd spoken to another person exactly twice. A backpacking couple on the northern trail who'd asked about water sources, and Desmond during our weekly radio check which lasted exactly 4 minutes. This solitude was what I'd wanted. But I was beginning to notice that it had a texture to it, a quality that shifted depending on the light and the weather, and something I couldn't quite name. On clear days, the silence felt like peace. On the stormy nights when the wind pushed against the cabin's wooden walls, it felt like something else entirely. It was during the second week of June when I first heard the sound that didn't belong. It happened at dusk, while I was preparing dinner. I'd just set a pot of water to boil on the stove when the noise came from somewhere near the lake. It wasn't a clear sound, which was part of what made it strange. It was a kind of keening, high-pitched and thin, that lasted maybe 5 seconds before cutting off abruptly. I stood with my hand on the stove knob, listening to the silence that followed, waiting to see if it would come again. It didn't. I told myself it was a bird, an elk calf perhaps. The mountains held thousands of sounds that I'd never heard before, and my city ears were still learning the vocabulary of the wild. But I went to the window and looked out across the lake anyway, where the light was the color of old amber and the far shore was already dark beneath the trees. Nothing moved in that darkness. The water was still. The wind had dropped away. I finished making dinner and didn't think about the sound again, though later, when I was lying in my bunk, I realized I'd been listening to it in memory rather than to any actual noise. This seemed important, though I couldn't have explained why. 3 days later, I found the elk calf. I was walking the eastern trail in the late morning, note-taking about a section where the soil had eroded significantly along one side of the path. The trail wound upward through forest, and I was mentally composing the repair recommendation in my head when I noticed a smell. Not strong enough to stop me immediately. Not a large carcass then, but distinctive. Something had died recently. 20 yards off the trail, caught in a tangle of deadfall, was what remained of a young elk. It had been dead perhaps 4 days, based on the degree of bloat and the insects that scattered as I approached. That itself wasn't unusual. Animals died in the wilderness constantly. But as I stood looking at the corpse, my mind caught on something my eyes had registered but my conscious awareness hadn't fully processed. The calf wasn't intact. Parts of it were missing. The hindquarters had been opened, and the organs were gone, not scattered or partially eaten, as a bear would have left them, but removed. The leg bones were exposed where the meat had been stripped away with a precision that suggested tools or at least a deliberate method. The violence suggested by the scattered white bone and dark flesh was clinical in a way that predator kills never were. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The incisions were too clean for a scavenger, too intentional. A hunter then. Someone had killed the calf and processed the meat. But that raised other questions. Poaching wasn't uncommon in the park, but it was usually crude. This had the quality of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I marked the location on my GPS unit and continued my patrol, though something had shifted in my attention. I found myself tracking for signs of a camp, looking for boot prints or the ashes of a fire. I found nothing. The forest gave up no evidence of human presence beyond the prepared carcass. That evening, I reported the dead elk to Desmond on the radio. He asked for the coordinates and said he'd add it to the patrol notes. He didn't seem surprised or particularly concerned. Happens sometimes, he said through the static. Check it again next week. If it's a poaching operation, we might catch them at it. That night, I heard the sound again. It came around 3 in the morning, pulling me up from a restless sleep. I lay in the bunk listening, my heart already accelerated by adrenaline. The keening was louder this time, and it lasted longer, maybe 8 seconds. It seemed to come from the direction of the lake, though it was hard to pinpoint in the darkness. There was something wrong with the sound that went beyond its strangeness. It carried a quality of distress, but not the kind of distress I associated with animals. It sounded almost like a voice trying to produce something it wasn't meant to. I got up and went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, high enough to silver the lake. I scanned the shoreline and the visible forest, looking for movement. Nothing. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was wind in the rocks, acoustic effects from the basin amplifying ordinary sounds into something that seemed unnatural. By the time I got back into the bunk, I'd mostly convinced myself. But I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I decided to check the area near the lake more carefully. I told myself this was due diligence, part of my job. Really, I just needed to dismiss the feeling that something was wrong. I found tracks about 200 yards north of the cabin, in a small clearing where a stream fed into the lake. They were in soft ground near the water's edge, and they were nothing I could identify. They were long and narrow, almost like a human footprint, but without the clear distinction of the heel and ball of the foot. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight, and it had a slight asymmetry that made the track seem lopsided. There were at least 6 distinct prints, forming a trail that led away from the water and into the forest. The arrangement was deliberate. Whatever had made them had been moving with purpose, not wandering. I photographed them with my phone and plotted the location on my GPS. Then I followed the trail into the forest. It led upward, through dense lodgepole forest where the sunlight barely penetrated. The tracks were difficult to follow, but there were broken branches and disturbed forest litter marking the path. I kept going higher, moving carefully, listening hard for any sound that might warn of another presence. The trail ended at a rock outcropping, perhaps half a mile from the lake. There were no more tracks after that point. I stood on the rocks, breathing hard from the climb, looking in all directions. Nothing but forest and stone and silence. When I turned to head back down, I noticed something I'd missed in my focus on the tracks. There were scratches on the stone of the outcropping, deep parallel gouges as if something with claws had dragged itself across the rock. The scratches were fresh. The exposed stone was pale, the lichen not yet grown back. They formed no particular pattern, but their presence suggested something urgent, something with claws large enough to scar solid rock. Something powerful. I returned to the cabin and sat on the porch for an hour, looking out at the lake and trying to integrate what I'd seen into some coherent narrative. A bear could account for the tracks perhaps if the ground was soft enough to distort the print. A large animal could have made the scratches, but nothing I'd learned in my ranger training quite fit. The tracks had the wrong geometry. The scratches didn't match any bear sign I'd ever seen. By evening, I was telling myself I'd been wrong about what I'd observed. Fear and solitude were a bad combination, Desmond had warned me. Your mind starts filling in blanks. I resolved to stop looking for mysteries and focus on my actual job, but I also started sleeping with a knife on the nightstand beside my bunk. The weather changed in the last week of June. A low-pressure system moved in from the west, bringing clouds that pressed down on the mountains like a physical thing. The temperature dropped. Rain came in sheets, turning the trails to mud and filling the cabin with the sound of water on the metal roof. During that week, I found 3 more carcasses. The first was another elk, this one an older cow, found in a ravine off the southern trail. Like the calf, it had been processed with a methodical precision that suggested human hands. The second was a mountain goat, younger, missing its entire front section. The third was a deer, barely more than bones and skin, positioned near the northern trailhead. I documented each discovery, took photographs, and marked the coordinates. I sent Desmond a summary of the finds via email using my satellite connection. His response was brief. Unusual frequency. Will alert Park Service to potential poaching operation. Continue routine patrols. The killings weren't the only thing happening. The sounds had become more frequent. Every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, the keening would come from somewhere beyond the cabin, sometimes from the north, sometimes from the east. The sound was evolving, becoming more complex. There seemed to be almost a rhythm to it, as if something was trying to shape the sound into communication rather than just releasing it as noise. I started keeping a detailed log, time of sound, approximate location, duration, changes in the quality or pattern. I told myself this was scientific. I was gathering data. The truth was that the logging gave me something to do with the fear that was becoming harder to dismiss. By the 28th of June, I was barely sleeping. I'd spend the dark hours lying in my bunk, listening, tracking the sounds by their direction and character. When dawn finally came, I'd feel the relief like a physical thing, as if daylight was a kind of protection that might actually work. It was on the morning of the 29th that I found the tracks again, but this time they were much closer to the cabin. They were in the soft earth near the water intake pipe, where I drew water for the cabin. The tracks were larger than the ones I'd seen before, deeper, showing more weight, and they formed a clear circuit around the north side of the cabin. Whatever had made them had walked completely around the building. The pattern showed it had stopped at the door and at both windows. My hands shook as I looked at them. This wasn't ambiguous anymore. Something was investigating the cabin, something large, something that had come in the night while I slept. I packed a bag with essentials and spent that day hiking out to the trailhead, moving quickly and listening for any sound in the forest behind me. I reached the main park road by mid-afternoon, reported my concern to the ranger station, and found myself being taken very seriously for the first time. Desmond arranged for me to spend the night at the ranger station, then returned with me to the cabin the following morning with 2 additional rangers and a wildlife biologist named Grant. They examined the tracks with professional skepticism that gradually shifted to genuine concern. "Could be a grizzly," Grant said, crouching beside the deepest impression. "Though the track geometry is unusual, and the behavior of circling the structure suggests, I'm not sure what it suggests. Bears don't typically do that." We checked the nearby forest, but there were no other signs. No scat, no fur caught on branches, no disturbed ground that might suggest a den. It was as if something had materialized from the darkness, walked around the cabin, and simply ceased to exist. That night, all 4 of us stayed in the cabin. We set up camp chairs and sat with coffee and a rifle propped against the table. Nothing came. The darkness remained silent. In the morning, looking at 4 sleep-deprived rangers staring out at a perfectly ordinary forest, I felt a surge of embarrassment. What exactly were we defending against? What had I convinced myself I'd seen? But Grant wasn't dismissing my concerns. He spent the morning examining the previous kill sites more carefully, taking samples and photographs. By noon, his expression had hardened into something I recognized as professional alarm. "Whatever took these animals had a specific method," he said. "The precision of the kills, the selective nature of what was consumed. This isn't typical predator behavior, and the number of kills in this area in such a short time frame is significant. We've found 5 carcasses in 7 days." Desmond agreed to keep additional patrols in my sector. Grant said he wanted to set up trail cameras to monitor the area. For the first time since the keening had started, I felt the weight lift slightly. I wasn't alone in this. I hadn't imagined it. But that night, after the other rangers had left and it was just me again in the cabin, the sound came back. It was closer this time, from a spot that seemed to be near the northern trailhead, and it continued for longer than before. Nearly 20 seconds of that thin, anguished keening that seemed to reach into my chest and twist something there. When it finally stopped, I sat in the darkness of the cabin with my hands covering my face, and I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever was making that sound, it knew I was here. It was calling to me in the only way it knew how, and it was hungry. By early July, the second killing had escalated. The carcasses were no longer hidden in remote ravines or found days after death. Grant's trail cameras caught footage of a dark shape moving through the forest at dusk and dawn, something bipedal and massive, moving with a distressing fluidity. The images were never clear, always obscured by trees or shadow, but they showed something that couldn't quite be reconciled with any animal I knew. Grant called in specialists from the regional office. They hiked in with equipment for wildlife tracking and sampling. They set live traps and motion sensors. They worked with the kind of urgency that suggested they were taking this seriously, but also with the kind of confusion that came from not knowing what they were actually hunting. I was supposed to remain at the cabin and maintain my patrols, but something had shifted in my understanding of my job. I was no longer monitoring the park. I was watching something watching me. Every hike on the trails felt like a performance, a way of signaling my presence to something that was evaluating me. The nights became the true danger. The keening had evolved from a distant sound into something that came right to the edge of the clearing. I'd lie in the bunk and hear it perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, a sound that carried hunger and frustration and something that might have been rage. On the nights when it came, I would light every lamp in the cabin and sit at the table with the rifle across my knees, waiting for dawn with the kind of intensity that made the hours feel like torture. It was during the 3rd week of July, during a night when the moon was hidden and the darkness was almost solid, that I heard something different. Not the keening, but voices. They were distorted, as if heard through thick glass or from a great distance, but they carried the tonal quality of human speech. Words I couldn't quite make out, repeated in a pattern that seemed almost like conversation. Two voices, possibly three, speaking over each other in a language that wasn't quite any language I knew. I stood at the cabin window, peering into darkness so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The voices continued for perhaps 2 minutes, then they stopped, and in their place came a sound that took me several seconds to identify. It was sobbing, genuine human sobbing, the sound of someone in profound distress. Without allowing myself to think, I grabbed the flashlight and a jacket and opened the cabin door. The moment I stepped outside, the sobbing stopped. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and I realized immediately that I'd made a terrible mistake. I was outside the light of the cabin, away from the rifle, exposed and disoriented. "Hello?" I called out. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" There was a pause. Then I heard footsteps moving through the forest to my left, not running, but walking with purpose. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam seemed to die in the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening with every part of my attention focused on the darkness around me. And then I heard breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing that came from multiple directions at once. No, not from multiple directions. I was becoming aware of something worse. The breathing was coming from the same location, but overlapping with itself, as if there were multiple presences sharing the same space, or as if something was breathing in a way that human lungs couldn't achieve. A shape moved at the edge of my flashlight's beam. Just an impression of size and dark mass, something that shifted between visibility and shadow. The breathing changed, became almost a growl, and I saw a moment of reflection in the darkness that might have been an eye. I didn't remember running. I was suddenly at the cabin door, fumbling with it, gasping in a way that felt like drowning in air. Behind me I heard something give voice to a sound that was neither the keening nor anything like a normal animal call. It was a sound of frustration, of hunger denied, of something that had come so close to contact and found the moment shattered. I got inside, slammed the door, and locked it with shaking hands. I stood with my back against the wooden surface, listening to the world outside press against the cabin's thin walls. The creature didn't approach again that night, but I heard it in the forest around the clearing, and I heard the voices again, that distorted human speech that seemed to come from inside my head and from the darkness simultaneously. The voices talked and talked through the hours until dawn, and I began to understand that what was out there was learning. Learning to speak, learning to imitate. Learning that sounds that approximated human communication could provoke responses that drawing blood could not. By dawn I was certain of something that I couldn't quite articulate in language, but knew with bone-deep certainty. Whatever was in the forest had been human once, or many humans, now. The keening, the footsteps, the attempt to speak, these were someone or several someones trying to bridge the gap between what they'd been and what they'd become, trapped in transformation, hungry in a way that the killing of animals could never satisfy. Grant found me on the morning of the 24th of July, sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the light on the lake. He'd come alone, hiking in early to check on the trail cameras. When he saw my state, I hadn't slept in 36 hours. He immediately suggested we head back out together. I refused. I told him what I'd heard, the voices, the attempted speech, the way the creature was changing its approach. He listened with the expression of someone trying to integrate information that didn't fit into any framework he understood. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "There are stories," he said finally. "Old ones, indigenous peoples who lived in this region before the park was established. They spoke of entities that could take on various forms, things that were created by extreme need and extreme violence in the wilderness. Starvation, desperation, people dying in ways that violated something fundamental. The stories call them Wendigos, though that's not quite the same as the way it manifests in stories from other regions." "You believe that?" I asked. "I believe something is out there that defies categorization, and I believe that the most dangerous things in wilderness are the ones that used to be human." He paused. "There are accounts, people who went missing in these mountains, hikers, hunters, rangers, more than the statistics would suggest." I thought about the voices, the way they'd seemed almost like conversation. Someone in there, still trapped inside the hunger, still attempting to communicate. "We need to kill it," Grant said. It wasn't a question. "Can we?" "We can try." They came the next day with equipment and hunters who knew mountain terrain. 5 of us in total. We set up a systematic search of the area, marking territories and moving in coordinated patterns. We found signs constantly. Tracks that showed the creature was moving faster as the days progressed, as if it was growing stronger. Scat that contained human remains along with animal matter. And once, scratched into a tree in a pattern that seemed almost intentional. Marks that resembled letters or symbols. On the second day of the hunt, we found what had once been a human body in a ravine, so decomposed that determining its identity was impossible. The creature had carefully placed it, arranged it as if in ritual. Nearby were other bones, older, worked by the weather and time into abstract shapes. That night we waited in ambush positions around the cabin. The creature came around midnight, but it didn't approach the structure. Instead, it seemed to acknowledge our presence. It made sounds, not the keening this time, but something almost like communication. Words, almost. Words that might have been a name. I understood then that it had been trying to reach me. Not to attack, but to connect. To bridge the gap between what it was and what it had been. The hunger was part of that desperation. One of the hunters fired at a shape moving through the darkness. The shot struck something and we heard a sound that was half roar, half scream, and very much in pain. The creature fled into the forest. We heard it crashing through the underbrush, heard it splash into the lake. We found blood on the rocks, tracks showing where it had entered the water. Grant and I stood at the shore in the gray light before dawn, looking out across the rippled surface. It drowned or swam across, he said. If it went across, it'll come back when the season turns. They always do. The park closed the area to hikers. They told the public it was due to bear activity and trail maintenance. A few journalists investigated, but there was nothing concrete to report. Missing hikers were sad facts of mountainous terrain. Unusual predator kills could be explained away. The voices I'd heard were attributed, in the official record, to my extended isolation and stress. I finished out my contract at Glacier, but the cabin became just a place I occupied without truly living. I spent my days on the trails documenting what I found, but I left the nights for the darkness and whatever moved in it. I began leaving food at the edge of the clearing. I'm not sure why. Some part of me understood that what was happening here wasn't a simple predator-prey scenario. Something was caught between states of being, desperate for connection in the only way it knew how. In August, I heard the voices again. One of them seemed familiar in a way I couldn't explain. It called something that might have been my name, though distorted through a throat that wasn't built to produce human sounds. I left the park in September, before the snows came. Grant told me that the creature was still active in the territory, that the Park Service was monitoring the situation. I know they'll never truly address it. How do you kill something that wants to be human, that remembers being human, that is screaming from inside the hunger for contact with its former life? The cabin sits empty now through the winters. I've applied for work in other parks, other remote places, but I know I'll come back to Glacier someday. I know that when the thaw comes and the ice clears from Gunsight Lake, the creature will emerge from wherever it shelters in the deep winter cold. And I know that I'll hear those voices again, trying to speak across the space between what it is and what it was, calling out in a language of starvation and transformation. Some prices for taking a job in the wilderness aren't paid in the moment. They're paid in every quiet night that follows, in the way certain sounds at certain times will always pull your attention up from whatever occupies you, in the way you'll always remember that the mountains hold things that shouldn't exist but do. And that sometimes those things are just asking to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be remembered for what they were before hunger rewrote them into something else. I accept that debt. It's the only way I know to honor what remains human in the darkness of those woods.